And we are live at the CrunchLabs Masters. Today is the final of Division 2 and Division 3. We will see if Grandmasters Alexander Grischuk and Yevgeny Alekseev can come all the way from the distant losers bracket and take their rightful place on the podium. They will need to win 2 matches against the likes of Vidit and Arjun. It'll be the Division 2 and Division 3 finals running in parallel. I am your host, Grandmaster Daniel Naroditsky, flying solo today. So you're stuck with me for the Division 2 and Division 3 final. What a terrible day, of course. My condolences. Nah, just kidding. I will try to make it fun for you and entertaining for you, even though I am all alone. It's just me, the chessboard, and you all. And of course, all of the Grandmasters who've made Division 2 and Division 3 very special. Obviously, our coverage has been focused on the top division, but that doesn't mean there hasn't been a lot of intrigue and a lot of action in the other 2 divisions. Let's take a look at the brackets starting from Division 1. Now, the final of Division 1 is coming your way tomorrow. I'll be covering that together with Grandmaster David Howell, 11 a.m. Eastern start time, and it will feature the grand final between MVL and Alireza Firouzja, some France-on-France action. We saw Alireza Firouzja defeat Jan Nepomniachtchi, who in turn defeated Magnus Carlsen in the losers bracket. So the grand final tomorrow, Alireza Firouzja will have to beat MVL twice. Of course, he pulled that feat off a couple months ago against a guy named Magnus Carlsen. So that's Division 1. Mark your calendars. That'll be tomorrow, Wednesday, with myself and David Howell. But today we are focused on the other 2 divisions, which have been proceeding along similar lines. Let's take a look at the Division 2 bracket, which has featured players like Hikaru Nakamura, Vladimir Fedoseev, really weak grandmasters who couldn't make their way to the top division. Of course, Hikaru lost early on in the top division to Jules Moussard. He came all the way through the losers bracket before losing in the losers final to Alexander Grischuk. That was happening yesterday as Alireza Firouzja was defeating Jan Nepomniachtchi, and that sets up the grand final between Grischuk and Vidit. Vidit has been spotless. He's beaten everybody. And in Division 3, in the losers bracket, it was Gabriel Sargsyan who was rising through the ranks and losing in the losers final to Yevgeny Alekseev. Yevgeny Alekseev will have the very unenviable task of facing Arjun Erigaisi, whom he has to defeat twice. So the grand final today features Arjun Erigaisi, the world number 4 according to the live rankings, as he takes on Yevgeny Alekseev, whose peak rating, by the way, was over 2,700. So it's important to note these aren't just random GMs off the street, but Arjun Erigaisi will have to be defeated twice for the player from the losers bracket to take the cake. Let's take a look at the overall tour standings, because it's kind of important to contextualizing where the players are at, who's doing well in the CrunchLabs Masters presented by Julius Baer. We see Magnus Carlsen, of course, and Alireza Firouzja by a country mile ahead of the rest of the pack. Jan Nepomniachtchi, the world champion contender, in 3rd. Vincent Keimer, who skipped out on this particular event, is still in 4th place. A cool 30 Gs he is collecting. Hikaru Nakamura and Fabiano Caruana, the stars of American chess, they're over on the right side. They will try to make a big run in these last couple of events. Of course, there is one more CCT event to close off this year's circuit, and I think that is the event players like Fabiano and Hikaru Nakamura will be targeting in order to try to rise through the rankings. Okay. And Julius Baer, of course, is a multinational private banking group headquartered in Zurich, specializing in wealth management and private banking services. They are also founding partner of the CCT, so thank you to Julius Baer for your support of this awesome event. Thank you also to Vidit for his support of the Division 2 final in which he is participating. He only needs to win 1 match. Now, the format is pretty simple. Those of you who've seen CCT events, you know the format. The first match is a best of 4. Okay, so potentially we will be having 2 matches between each of these sets of players. The first match is a best of 4. If the player who comes from the winner's bracket wins this match, the match is over. So if Vidit wins, the Division 2 is over. If Arjun Erigaisi wins, Division 3 is over, and these games will be happening in parallel. So I'll be covering both at the same time. If the player from the loser's bracket wins, then they are playing the grand final reset, which is actually a best of 2. So the maximum number of games that we could see today in either of these matches is 5 in the first one if they go 2-2 and then play an Armageddon, plus another 2 if they go 1-1 in the grand final reset and the Armageddon. So we could get upwards of 8 games today if these matches go on. But it's important to realize this first match is a best of 4. If the player from the losers bracket wins, that triggers a grand final reset, which is then a best of 2, which means that Yevgeny Alekseev and Alexander Grischuk will have to defeat their opponents in 2 separate matches, which is a feat that has been pulled off before, most recently by Alireza Firouzja, who's done it against Magnus Carlsen. So there is a precedent. This is not a hypothetical. And obviously, I think Vidit is a favorite. I think Arjun is a heavy favorite. But Arjun has been very hot and cold in the CCT. He's had some incredible moments. He's had some forgettable moments. So I think Yevgeny Alekseev is not going to go gentle into that good night. The time control is the same as it's been throughout the CCT, 10 minutes per player with a 2-second increment. I'll be relying on the 2-board view to give you an idea of what's going on both boards. But obviously, we will keep our general focus on Division 2. But we will be looking at the Division 3 final as well once that game heats up. The final preparations being made here. The games should kick off any moment. And once again, I thank you for joining me on this Tuesday as we watch the Division 2 and Division 3 finals. Good look there at the protagonists, Arjun on the right, Yevgeny Alekseev. And that board is on the right as well. Yevgeny Alekseev was on the left side of the camera. Now, he's a grandmaster with a tremendous amount of experience. He was over 2,700 FIDE, and he doesn't play tournament chess quite as frequently anymore. I think he's under 2,600, but that does not tell you about his actual playing strength, and I think he demonstrated it here in the CCT as the games are underway. Alexander Grischuk actually taking his time on the second move and deciding to roll out a London system. So actually a London system on both boards as Arjun also decides on a London system against Yevgeny Alekseev. So we have a very similar structure already. Now, I think Vidit probably did not expect a London system from Grischuk because he's taking a pretty significant chunk of time in the early going, just deciding on which setup he wants to roll out. Obviously, on the left side there of your screen, Black has a bunch of viable moves. C7, C5 is what Yevgeny Alekseev has opted for. And we'll take a look at the Alekseev game first, I think, because that game is a little bit further progressed, and then maybe we can go to the Vidit game. So let me just pull up the Yevgeny Alekseev final. Just a moment here. There we go. Okay, so let's zoom into the right side of the screen here and see if Yevgeny Alekseev has what it takes to defeat the world number 4. This is, of course, the Division 3 final, and Black has already seized the bishop pair. So it may seem like Arjun opening choice is completely innocuous, but that is far from the truth. So what's happened here is, if we rewind a little bit, we had this very, very standard position. And it used to be kind of automatic to play bishop d6, but a couple of years ago, Gatakomsky in the U.S. Championship, or Hikaru Nakamura against Gatakomsky, played this very interesting system where he put a knight on h5, and it turned out that this bishop is kind of out of oxygen. So it has to drop back to e3. Black's bishop is able to access this really nice developing square, and then very quickly, Black kind of seizes the bishop pair. The downside of this system is that White still has this vice-like grip over the e5 square. And Alekseev doesn't seem to worry about that. He brings his king up to g7. But the issue is that as long as Black is unable to break free in the center with e5, he will be experiencing major positional problems because of the bishop on c8. This is sort of a French-like bishop that's locked behind the pawn chain. And I think Arjun is demonstrating complete command of the typical ideas in this position as he lifts his pawn up to b4, preparing to reinforce his control of the e5 square if necessary. It doesn't mean he's going to play b5 on the next move, but should Yevgeny Alekseev show signs that he wants to liberate himself in the center, if he plays a move like f6, it's a very good button to be able to press to play b5 and kick the knight away from c6. So It just seems like Arjun is more familiar with this type of structure. Black's position, of course, very solid, currently devoid of weaknesses. But Arjun Erigaisi, look at the pawn play on both sides of the board. He plays b4 in order to discourage Black from ever playing e5. And on the next move, he plays h4, poking and prodding, trying to create weaknesses, attackable weaknesses on the king side. Alekseev responds with h6, but that is a risky move. And I think Arjun believes he's going to win this game because he understands the ideas better. And now he can play h5 at some point. Why did he play queen e2? I think after h5, g5, he now wants to be able to build a battery against Black's king with bishop d3 to b1, and then the queen sliding from e2 and occupying the bishop's former place. And again, Black is acutely feeling the absence of the light squared bishop. It exists, it's on the board, but it's essentially absent from the game. And Arjun Erigaisi wants to make Yevgeny Alekseev pay for that. I think White has a sizable advantage here in the early going, as Arjun demonstrates his positional knowledge of the London system. A good time, perhaps, to go to our other game and to see how Vidit is faring. It was a pretty slow start, but now we have a really interesting structure in our Division 2 final as we take a quick look at the two-board view there with Vidit facing Alexander Grischuk, another London system, and actually another pawn on h4. So Alexander Grischuk and Arjun Erigaisi are both showing the sort of 2024 version of the London system, which is very different from the way the London system used to be played, right? Strictly positional, very by the book, kind of execute all of the standard moves. I don't even recognize this pawn structure. This almost looks like a Jabava London pawn structure. So how is there a knight on c3? Wasn't there supposed to be a pawn on c3? So how did this happen? Let's rewind a little bit. Now, after Grischuk's third move, Vidit took a while kind of choosing the setup that he wanted to play. He ended up going for bishop f5, which is one of Black's many standard options. Sasha Grischuk responded with bishop d3, and here you might be kind of used to Black playing the move bishop g6, but instead Vidit simply traded on d3, leading to this really interesting pawn cube in the center that you don't always get in the London system. That is how a knight landed on c3 instead of a pawn. And Grischuk wasted no time continuing his expansion in the center, e4, and then e5, locking up the center, pushing the knight out of the way, and h4, signaling that he is probably not going to castle to the king side, but rather keep his king in the center. Knight a6, queen e2, and now b5 by Vidit, who understands that he does not have a lot of time to waste because Grischuk's kingside attack is coming fast and furious. The big question now for White is, well, there's two questions. The first is, how do you prosecute the attack on the king side? Because the obvious move here is to go h5 and then to essentially do what Arjun Erigaisi is doing and try to shove this pawn up to h6. If you do that, though, Black will play g6 and then look at you and ask, okay, well, what are you doing now? The other option, and the option that I think maybe is a little bit more enticing for Grischuk, is actually to play rook h3 and rook g3, and to basically try to lead with the pieces. So by doing so, he will potentially force Grischuk's king, or Vidit's king, into the corner, and then maybe lift the knight up to g5 at the right moment, and engineer this kind of typical construction with a knight on g5 and a queen on h5. But all of that is in the future. First, Grischuk tries to find safer accommodations for his king, and he plays king f1, which I think is a very instructive move, right? Castling is not the only way of ensuring the safety of your king, and the drawback of White castling kingside here would be very obvious. It's not that White's king would be unsafe, it's that the rook would automatically be taken out of the action. So Grischuk wants to reserve the possibility of playing the move rook h3, and that's why he doesn't want to castle. It's not that he doesn't want to get the king to the relative safety of the king side. He does, and so he kind of finds the middle ground by sliding his king over to f1. And now it's Black to play. Now the ball is back in Vidit's court. The logical continuation here is b4, and maybe he wants to try to reopen the center with c5. That is probably the most effective way of taking White's attention away from the king side. But we will see. We'll see what Vidit decides on. He decides on rook to c8, so he's clearly making preparations for a reopening of the center, preparing in the move c5. And now, once again, The question for Grischuk, does he want to play king g1? No, it's time for rook h3. It's time for concrete action on the king side. And that rook is coming into g3 fast and furious. Okay, and b4 by Vidit, starting off the queenside attack. And it's an odd-looking move. King f1, but it's actually very logical. It's like you're castling, but you're doing so while keeping your rook in the action. Just one moment here. So much action on the boards, I had to fire up the air conditioner. It's too hot on the board. It's too hot off the board. And now it's time for c5. I don't see any reason for Vidit to waste any more time. I think he has to get the party started on the queen side, because if you give Grischuk 2 or 3 more moves, right, how long is it going to take for white to generate concrete threats on the king side? Well, it's going to take him 1 more move, right? If he plays rook g3, white is already threatening the move bishop h6. Now, Vidit can buy himself a little bit more time by sliding his king over to h8, but then white's coming in with the knight g5, and then queen h5 is a huge threat. So Vidit has no more time to waste. He's up 2 minutes on the clock, which is potentially going to be important, although we are dealing here with Alexander Grischuk, so that's not surprising. He's under 5 minutes, though. The time might become a factor pretty soon. We're only on move 15. The real brunt of the action hasn't started yet, and you don't want to leave yourself with just a couple of seconds to manage your way out of the complications, even though Grischuk managed to do that very successfully yesterday against Hikaru Nakamura. I'm also keeping an eye on the other board. The developments on the Division 3 final Game 1 have been, let's just say, less tactical, less kind of zesty. The position there still, I would say, slightly better, perhaps for Arjun Erigaisi, but let's keep our attention on this game for now. Let's see how Alexander Grischuk manages the 2 tasks in this position. The first, of course, to keep developing his kingside attack, and the second is to control the situation in the center and not to allow Vidit's pieces to jump in and access commanding posts in the center. He's now 3 minutes down on the clock. Big moment here. Big choice for Grischuk, and he's under 4 minutes. Now, as we await his move, which I'm expecting rook g3, but that's far from the only candidate move, he might revert back to the old idea with h5. He might play a more positional move, like knight d1 to e3, assembling his pieces in the center and kind of maintaining the status quo. It's important to point out that, and rook g3 is played, king h8, I think, is going to follow pretty much automatically. Technically, Vidit could take this pawn on h4, but this is kind of doing white's bidding for him. For people just joining, you shouldn't think that Division 3 is some sort of a dishonor and you're automatically worse if you're in Division 3. The division placement depends on your performance in the play-in, which Jan Nepomniachtchi won a couple of days ago. I think this was on Friday or maybe on Saturday. We had the play-in, which determined the initial ranking and which determined the players' initial divisional seedings. Arjun Erigaisi lost in the last round to Mikhail Antipov, who ended up in Division 1, and that is why Arjun Erigaisi started off in Division 2. He lost another match, got knocked down to Division 3, but then climbed all the way up to the winners final. So just because you're in Division 3 doesn't mean you're not an elite player. We had tons of elite grandmasters starting their journey from the 3rd division. Speaking of elite grandmasters, Alexander Grischuk, 2 minutes now on the clock. He's trying to figure out a way to keep his kingside attack going. I don't see a concrete way forward. The problem with a move like knight g5 is that black is simply going to take on g5. And white can open up the h file in response, but the rook has already departed the h file. So then it's going to take you 2 more moves to get your rook back to h3. And Vidit is going to take all of that time in order to generate serious play on the queen side, let alone the fact that you're going to lose the d4 pawn. h5 is Grischuk's choice. He is trying to provoke Vidit into playing the move h6. Is there a bishop sacrifice on the horizon? That's a big question. So now Vidit could play his own pawn up to h6, but I doubt that he's going to bother with that because h6 from Grischuk is not really a threat. As I indicated previously, Vidit could meet that move with g6 and keep the king side closed. If I'm Vidit, I'm focusing instead on kind of executing my priorities on the center and on the queen side, and I'm playing c takes d4. That would be my choice here if I were Vidit, but he's got 6 minutes on the clock and plenty of time to prosecute these complications successfully. If we could pull up an analysis board, I just want to quickly show what the problem is with a move like h6, because I think a lot of players would do this automatically. The problem is not that white will take on h6. This is premature, because after g takes h6, queen e3, white is threatening mate in 1, but the black king is more than capable of, zipping up its own pants here, and white has no good way to reinforce the attack on the h6 pawn. Instead, white would make the preparatory move, queen to d2. Now bishop takes h6 is a threat, but after king h7, white hasn't committed to sacrificing anything yet, and white could follow up with knight to e3, then bring this knight over to g4, and add a third attacker on the h6 pawn, at which point things would get acutely bad. So there is absolutely no reason for Vidit to play the move h6 and to create additional targets for Grischuk. We see c takes d4. It's on the board. Grischuk does play h6. So he's indicating that he doesn't see a clear way to generate immediate threats. Instead, he's trying to create the preconditions for maybe a later attack along the dark squares. But all of this is very hypothetical, because look at how robust the pawn cover around black's king is. All of these pawns are on light squares. White lacks a light squared bishop. He would love a light squared bishop. He would probably sacrifice it on e6. White lacks the ability to break down black's pawn cover. So I almost feel like the initiative has shifted to Vidit's side. Grischuk made a bunch of logical moves. He wasn't really able to make the kind of progress that he wanted. And now Vidit finally can devote his attention to the queen side. Let's devote our attention, though, to the other game, because there are some concrete developments in Arjun Eragisi's game. So let's go back to the two-board view for a little while, and let's just chill here. On the right side, you have Arjun Eragisi, who's basically been better for the entire game, right? He was slightly better out of the opening, and the structure, the pawn structure hasn't really changed, nor has the fact that he's been exerting this massive pressure on Yevgeny Alekseev's clock and Yevgeny Alekseev's position. You can see his rooks on the right side of your screen. They're doubled on the A file, pressuring Alekseev's pawn on A7. That cannot be given away. If it's given away, Arjun Eragisi will have a extra and protected passer on B5 that's likely going to decide the game. And that is why black has doubled their rooks on the 7th rank in order to lend maximum protection to the A7 pawn. Alekseev keeps shaking his head. He's been shaking his head this entire game. I've been keeping an eye on his camera. So I wouldn't put too much stock in that. On the left side, we have a very committal move by Vidit. He's played the move d4, opening up the d5 square, possibly potentially for his knight, which can get there via b6. So a positional pawn sacrifice, which actually makes a lot of sense to me, Vidit's move, especially in light of the fact that Grischuk is now under a minute. Imagine having the position on the left side there under a minute. Your king's on f1. Your pieces are scattered about the board. Grischuk responds by declining the positional sacrifice, instead opting for the bishop trade there. The bishops are off the board. Vidit patiently follows through with knight to b6. That knight is going to sink its teeth into the juicy d5 square. Grischuk tries to maximize the activity of his rook. He plays rook to g4. Both games are about to heat up. I think the Grischuk game is already heating up. So let's stay here for a little while longer and see which game explodes first. Arjun Eragisi, his time down to 3 minutes as he tries to find a way to exert more pressure on Alekseev's king side. The problem is, as nice as his pieces look, how is he actually going to make Alekseev suffer further? Because the a7 pawn, it looks weak, but so is the b5 pawn. And black's rook from c7 can slide over to b7, which I think is exactly what's going to happen here as Arjun plays rook c6. Alekseev says, over my dead body, I'm not trading rooks on c6. What, I'm going to give you a passed pawn on c6? No way. He slides his rook to b7. Looks like Arjun Eragisi's efforts at keeping up the pressure are getting consistently frustrated here, and the time situation is starting to equalize. Arjun now down under 3 minutes. He brings his other rook to a6. Look at the way that the rooks are arranged there. White's rooks on a6 and c6. Kind of a parallelogram that can be drawn given the rook placement, but it's the Vidit Grischuk game that I'm really looking at. Moves are coming in a mile a minute. Let's focus in on the left side there. I think that game is definitely heating up first. Grischuk has indeed captured the pawn on d4, and he's done so by trading off a bunch of pieces. So he's currently up a pawn. We can zoom into that game. Grischuk is under 20 seconds. Vidit's queen now on g5. He's trying to eliminate the major source of tactical problems here, which is the h6 pawn. The h6 pawn is what is keeping Black's rook tied down to the 8th rank. Knight to c3 by Grischuk. Vidit has 3.5 minutes. He's got plenty of time to figure all of this out. And he has to figure out, oh my gosh, a lovely tactic that the computer is indicating here. The computer is saying, that's not my arrow, that's the engine arrow, saying that knight d5 is actually the only move to avoid being lost. And I'm just going to quickly show the idea here. Knight to d5, the idea is not just to take back on d5. No. It's to play rook c1 check, exploiting the weakness of white's king. Queen takes c1, queen to h1. And if you thought that was the end of the story, you would be wrong. White has knight f6, so white still has a powerful attack against Black's king. Vidit's missed it, though. Vidit's missed it. He's played g5. Now queen h3 by Grischuk will secure a winning advantage. The player from the loser's bracket has to start strong. Grischuk finds it. Oh my gosh, with just a couple seconds left on his clock, he finds queen h3. He finds a way to keep this h6 pawn alive, and Vidit might just be completely lost here. And the problem is not that he's getting mated. That's not the problem. The problem, well, he might be getting mated, but the problem is right now he's a pawn down. He doesn't have access to the d5 square any longer because knight d5 no longer works. And Grischuk is just going to continue by starting to wrap his tentacles around some of these weaknesses on the king side, like knight e4 is in the cards, maybe a move like queen h5. So Grischuk's subsequent play here is rather easy. And I don't think that his time situation is going to be a major factor. Yevgeny Alekseev's time situation, in the meantime, has become a major factor. Maybe it's a good time to go back to the two-board view, because I think Arjun is doing something pretty similar to what Grischuk has been able to do as they go into an endgame. A queen trade. Vidit still has some drawing chances there. I'm not sure about Grischuk's last move. He decided to trade queens on g6, but that has given Black's king a clear roadmap to activation. Black's king can now pick up Vidit's pawn on h6 on the left side there. In the meantime, Arjun has doubled his rooks on the c-file. Alekseev is down to 30 seconds. He is a good blitz player as he gets his queen into b1. Let's zoom into the right side there. Arjun, I think, is going to take this game. Rook c8, a brilliant move. Threatening rook takes b8 and queen e5. Yevgeny Alekseev brought his queen back to f5. I think that was the only move. But I think it's going to be a good day for the London system. Queen to e3. Up goes Erigaisi's queen. Black is tied this way and that way. What does Alekseev do? Look at how tied down he is. He can't move this rook. He can move his bishop to d6, but Arjun will just slide his rook up to c6. Now Erigaisi could even double rooks on the 8th rank, and that might seal the deal. Rook to e8. Then the other rook could come to c8, and then he will create massive threats along the 8th rank, not to mention that White's knight can join the action when the time is right. With a jump to g5, I think this is completely winning for Erigaisi, a lot more winning than Alexander Grischuk's position. And let's see how Erigaisi, the Indian Grandmaster, the number 4 rated player in the world, will choose to prosecute this winning advantage. My vote is rook e8. But obviously, there's going to be multiple ways to keep the decisive advantage alive. Rook e8 is on the board, and rook takes b8 simply picks up a piece and wins the game. This one's over. Let's shift our attention back to Grischuk versus Vidit, because that endgame is still ongoing. Alekseev resigns. Let's quickly go back to the other game, because it looks like Vidit is saying, I am not giving up easy. I am going to keep fighting. On the left side there, Alexander Grischuk is helping himself to Vidit's pawns, but vice versa. Knight to d5 by Grischuk. There are some stalemate ideas that are very much alive. Black's king is actually stalemated here, if you notice, with the rook on a7 cutting off its access. So if Vidit did not have a knight here, I think that the draw would be easier to achieve with a sort of renegade rook construction. If I were Vidit, I would be very seriously considering rook c1 followed by knight f3, trying to forcibly give up all of Black's pieces, as long as the king remains on h6, and as long as White's rook is kept on the 7th rank, it's going to be, stalemate is going to be in the cards. Knight to g7, though, by Vidit. He goes fully passive, preventing the checkmate threat on h7. Grischuk trying to set up some sort of a mating net, but I don't think he's succeeding. Rook to f7. Grischuk with 5 seconds on the clock. I don't see why you can't take that pawn. I think you can. And I don't think Grischuk has anything other than repetition here. Maybe he was relying on rook f8. As he repeats moves here, it's going to be a draw. Vidit saves the day. Maybe Grischuk was hoping for rook f8 and forgot that black simply has the move knight e6 there, vacating the g7 square for the king. It's a save by Vidit. He was completely lost at some point. I'm just going to quickly show here what Grischuk might have missed. He might have thought that after rook f8, this threat is unstoppable. Absolutely not. Black plays knight e6. And if white plays rook h8, white is actually the one who loses the game. So the big mistake toward the end of the game happened here. Grischuk had to bring his rook back to a3 and then across to h3. And here he would have likely kept a decisive advantage. But finally, the time situation bit him in the you-know-where. Still, it was a very, very good first game for the two players coming from the losers bracket. It wasn't enough, though. Yevgeny Alekseev, he loses the game. That puts him on the brink against Arjun Erigaisi. A valiant effort, but a good day for the London system thus far. Arjun Erigaisi, 1.5 points away from securing victory in the third division. And up top in the second division, Alexander Grischuk, not able to start with victory. Vidit with a beautiful save. He was lost. He was lost on the board. He was not lost on the clock. And as experienced of a time pressure scrambler as Alexander Grischuk is, it ultimately was an important factor. Vidit saves the game. We remind you that this is a best of 4. We see Yevgeny Alekseev there showing that he's got both of his cameras intact. Alexander Grischuk will have to step up his game. He'll have the white pieces in the second game. And this is a best of 4. First player to 2.5 either wins the entire thing or forces a grand final reset. A beautiful look there as Alexander Grischuk, a little bit frustrated, maybe frustrated at the way the game has gone. And there goes Vidit, the crowd favorite. Now, in a best-of-4 situation, you don't want to put too much weight on any one particular game. You want to manage your risk. But if you're coming from the winner's bracket, from personal experience, it's important not to get too relaxed because you might tell yourself, if you're Vidit, I can lose this match. I'll just have another chance. So I really don't have to treat this like it's kind of a winner-go-home situation. But what that causes is that causes you to play too relaxed because your opponent is playing with a sense of desperation. Your opponent is playing with a fire under their belly, and you want to do the same thing. So if you're Vidit or Arjun, you want to end this match in the grand final. You don't want this going to a grand final reset where absolutely anything can happen. Well, speaking of anything can happen, we have two different moves. D4 by Vidit and Yevgeny Alekseev opts for the king's pawn game. And it's a Rossolimo as Arjun Erigaisi, the multifaceted, multi-talented Arjun Erigaisi, who can play just about anything on the first move. He's been a longtime French player. In this game, opting for a Sicilian and quickly getting his knight to g6, which is a kind of common idea in e6 Sicilians. Pretty sure they're still following some mainline theory. And for the second time in a row, the Vidit Grischuk game is kind of takes a little bit longer to get started, as Vidit has taken his time in the opening, deciding on a setup against the London system in the first game. And this time trying to figure out, does he want to play a Catalan? Does he want to put his bishop on g5? He does opt for a slightly unusual Catalan, I should say, because generally in the Catalan, white's knight is developed to d2. So this type of Catalan with a knight already sitting on c3 was kind of heavily developed by Vladimir Kramnik in the last couple of years of his classical chess career. So he contributed to the theory of this line. And it's actually a pretty dangerous sideline system. So I think that Vidit's approach here is really to test Grischuk's memory, to test Grischuk's knowledge of a slightly more obscure opening. But let's start from the third division, just like we did for game one. And let's zero into that really interesting, I would almost call it a Marozzi bind setup against Arjun Erigaisi's Sicilian. This started off as a Rossolimo. And I think that this position testifies to the fact that the Sicilian is not just a tactical opening. There's a lot of very positional variations in the Sicilian. And the Rossolimo, I think, is a great example of a variation that can be either very tactical. Typically, if black plays like g6 in this position, there are some very topical lines where white plays a sort of souped-up Alapin with c3, and things can get very tactical here. Alternatively, Magnus Carlsen played this e5 move, which makes things very tactical as well. The center explodes very quickly. But the setup that Arjun has chosen with the knight coming to g6, even though it may resemble an open Sicilian, it's very different because both sides castle to the same side of the board. White exerts his control over the center with the move c4, trying to discourage black from playing d5. That is kind of the point of this setup. And Arjun says, no problem. I don't need to play d5 for a happy life. I can just keep my pawn on d7. Happy pawn, happy life. Well, I don't think the pawn is too happy because Alekseev has a very clear roadmap of developing the central pressure. He's going to go rook d1. He's basically going to pre-move rook d1 on the next move. And Arjun has to find a way either to protect this pawn, which might mean putting it up on d6 and then protecting it with the bishop, but that's a little bit passive. So there's also a lot of tactical ways that black can try to go about discouraging white from taking on d7. So one move that would be on my radar is queen to c7 or queen to c8. Maybe queen to e7 is a less awkward way of moving the queen from its initial square. Of course, queen c7 might run into knight b5, and you also don't want to give white this outpost on d6. So you can simply play queen e7 and then put your own rook on d8, and then put the other rook on c8. And that is exactly what he does. Queen e7, very heads-up move by Alireza, really showing a sense of alertness and awareness of where the danger is coming from. Now, Alekseev, very likely to put a rook on d1, but people watching this, y'all can relate. One of the hardest questions in chess, which rook do I put on a particular square? And the prescribed formula for deciding this is often to look at the other rook and to say, well, is the other rook going to feel left out? Is the other rook going to have somewhere to be, somewhere to go, something to do? But that sounds good on paper. A lot of the time, you can't figure that out. So one case could be made for rook a d1 in the sense that maybe the other rook wants to stay on the king's side in order to prepare potential f4 pawn push. So it would be nice to keep the rook there. The other case could be made, and Alekseev is actually making this case, that the other rook instead wants to be on e1, and it just kind of wants to chill on this square. In the event that Arjun eventually plays a move like d5, this rook is going to have its moment in the sun. So it's an interesting choice by Alekseev to centralize his rooks the way that he has. I think for Alireza, there is less of a decision to make. The other rook basically has to come to c8. That's the only feasible square that this rook could park itself on. And it's important that knight b5 can essentially always be met with d7, d5. So this is actually why Arjun does not really have to waste a tempo or waste a pawn, in this case, on the move a6. Now, generally in these setups, you see black automatically trying to play the move a6. Here, Arjun can do without it. And instead, he parks his bishop on c6, adding another layer of protection to this pawn on d7, just making sure that this pawn cannot be captured, even if the queen moves out of e7. I think his next move is going to be rook a to c8. And even though the engine is giving a tiny advantage to white here, probably because he has a little bit more space, I actually like Arjun's position. I think black's position is pretty easy to play. And I would also be paying attention to some of these dark squares. Bishop to e5, followed by queen to f6 maybe, can try to establish a knight on f4. So eventually those dark squares surrounding white's king might become a source of concern for Alekseev. But all of this is super hypothetical. It's far in the future. Let's take our attention to the other game. In the Division 2 final, the second game is underway as well. As we take a quick look at the two-board view there, Vidit has a pawn on h4 for the second time in a row. It seems like in every opening now, the idea of pushing h4 has become fashionable. That's an Alpha Zero contribution to our understanding of the game. And in the position there on the left, I can totally see why Vidit put his pawn on h4 on the last move. He's preparing the move knight g5. And the move h4 is not a serious weakening of his king because he's got a bishop on g2 that's safely protecting his king. And once again, Alexander Grischuk is deep in the tank. He's already at 6 minutes, and he's got some problems to solve. And I think he's doing it nicely with h6, very alert move, preventing the knight from jumping into g5. And now the question is, okay, you played h4, you looked cool for a moment. What's your follow-up? And my bigger question is, how did we reach this position? Because this started out as a Catalan. Now it looks more like a sort of traditional Queen's Gambit decline structure. So let's rewind a little bit and let's try to put things into context. How did we get this pawn structure in the first place? So we saw Vidit play the move g3, which is a slightly less common version of the Catalan. Alexander Grischuk decided against taking on c4, which I think is the main line. Instead, he played knight b to d7, queen to d3 by Vidit. Okay, pretty standard move. That was met with b6. And the idea of b6 is actually to put the bishop on a6, creating this really nasty pin. So Vidit decided the time was ripe for an exchange on d5. Wow, Grischuk recapturing with a knight, leading to a further exchange, bishop b7 and c5. So that's how this structure was reached. And Grischuk advances his pawn down the a file. Vidit plays the move h4, just another day in the life of a grandmaster in the modern chess era. h4 is followed by a5. As it so often is in modern chess these days. Now, Vidit centralizes his knight, and I think Grischuk's last move is an excellent one. He plays knight f6, and what he's basically saying is that this knight on e5 looks really pretty, but it doesn't have access to any of the really juicy squares inside of Black's territory. Knight c6 is never a thing. That knight on e5 is sitting pretty, but Black's knight on e4 is actually going to be getting more things done than its counterpart on e5. So Grischuk has this idea of playing knight e4. He can open up the a file at the right moment and potentially stick a rook on a3. And Vidit has completely abandoned the queen side here, and eventually Grischuk can try to make him pay for it. I'm actually starting to like Black's position here, even though currently it may seem like White has more space. White has pretty harmoniously placed pieces, but he's got these latent problems that might start to make their presence felt if Grischuk is able to exert pressure on Vidit's queen side. So a takes b3 might be on the horizon. Black's knight likely coming into e4. And obviously, Vidit reserves the possibility of taking on c5, leading to what we call the hanging pawn structure, where typically it's Black who has hanging pawns. That means basically pawns on the c file and the d file that are on an island, that are isolated from the rest of the pawns. And we might get a queen trade here. We might get a queen trade, but there is this idea that's super easy to miss, and it involves White's knight dropping back to c4. So if Vidit takes on c8 and Grischuk takes back with the f rook, which he likely will, White's knight can actually drop back to c4. This move would work tactically because Black can't take the knight. The bishop on b7 would fall with a fork. And the point of knight c4, of course, is to attack the b6 pawn. I think Vidit's going to do it. I think we're going to get knight c4. And from c4, the knight can drop further back to e3, which is actually a much more effective square than e5. Because on e3, it would not only be threatening to jump to f5, but it would be exerting concrete pressure on the d5 pawn. And then d takes c5 would become a serious possibility. So knight c4. A very nasty move for Grischuk to face here. I don't think it changes the evaluation. I still think Black is fine. But at the very least, it would pose some very concrete problems for the Russian Grandmaster. Vidit could also choose to take on c5. Nothing wrong with that. He does. And maybe if Grischuk takes back with a pawn, maybe then White plays knight c4, which is a strong move, even if there is nothing on b6. You don't need there to be anything on b6. You would still be threatening to jump to b6 with a fork. So Grischuk, I think, sensing the danger, investing some thought into the possibility of bishop takes c5, which in a middle game you would never do. But in an endgame, piece activity becomes a lot more important than sort of the aesthetic appeal of your pawn structure. He does take with a pawn, and I am fully expecting, no, knight c4 does not happen. And instead, Vidit brings his rook up to d2, I think in an admission that he's not a huge fan of his position. I don't think that there's a concrete attacking idea inherent in this move. I think this is a defensive move. And I think Vidit is basically trying to bail this game out and would be very happy with a draw at this point. I think, once again, for the second time, Alexander Grischuk is the one calling the shots in the endgame. He needs to find a way to attack this pawn. This is Vidit's main target. Vidit also has to be very, very careful not to lose the attention on the center, because that bishop on f4 is anything but safe. If Black's bishop, for example, were on d6 in this very position, Black would have the sort of typical undermining idea, g7, g5, undermining the bishop on f4. So these pieces are not very stable. The pawn on b3 is weak, But if you try to attack it directly with the move rook a3, then for the umpteenth time, you actually might be running into knight c4, which in that case will be used as a kind of bailout operation with the knight coming into a5 and then eliminating the bishop on b7. I think a draw is the likeliest result. Rook a3 is played. No, rook b1. So as insistent as I've been on knight c4, Grischuk shuts the door on that idea with bishop a8. Very, very clear. Yeah, he is trying to bring the bishop to a defended square. Finally, he prevents knight c4, and he is hinting at the possibility of rook b8. But I'm not a huge fan of this move, bishop a8, because now the bishop is kind of out of the game. It can't really access any other diagonals easily, and Vidit simply slides his rook to c2, saying, wait a second, you still have these hanging pawns. I can still attack them even in an endgame, and I don't think rook b8 is feasible at all in this position because it runs into a whole manner of discovered attacks. Knight takes f7, knight c6 maybe, knight c4 even. Our favorite move that's never going to happen might actually happen if black plays rook b8. So I'm actually not so sure that that Grischuk is the one calling the shots anymore. I think his last two moves, rook to a3 followed by bishop a8, that basically gave Vidit a chance to coordinate his pieces, deflect, thwart Grischuk's attempts at immediately picking up this pawn. And now it's just not clear how black reinforces his pressure on the queen side. The tables might very well turn. I think the position's probably equal objectively, which is maybe a good opportunity for us to look at the other game and the way that it's developing, the Division 3 final between Arjun and Yevgeny Alekseev, which will conclude if Arjun Erigaisi reaches 2.5 points. He leads 1-0, winning the first game in very convincing fashion. Yevgeny has to make use of the white pieces. He cannot simply phone it in and allow Arjun to hold a draw. We know how dangerous the world number 4 is with the white pieces. Let's take a closer look because Alekseev did end up pushing f4, but the move isn't as effective when there are as few minor pieces remaining on the board as there are. Arjun has just responded with bishop b7. A queen trade is very likely in this game, I think, one way or the other. Black can trigger the exchange of queens whenever he wants to. White is actually trying to do that with queen d2. And now the question for Arjun, does he want to trade on d2? Does he want to fall back to c5 with a check? And if he falls back to c5, will Alekseev opt for the repetition with queen d4? Given the context, given the circumstances, I think white has to be very ambitious here. Arjun probably more than happy with a draw in this game. King h1 is played, but let's not forget these pawns on c4 and e4, yeah, they're the pride of white's position, but they're also targets. They're targets and they're hooks, and one very typical idea for black involves playing b5 at the right moment, essentially trying to undermine the c4 pawn. And if you undermine that pawn, then you undermine white's control over the d5 square, making a d5 break also very likely. Instead, queen a3 by Arjun is met with queen knight d4 by Alekseev. Obviously, black has to make sure that this queen has some oxygen to breathe. Knight c2 could be a nasty idea. Actually, I think we're going to see the knight dropping back to c2, and things are going to get pretty interesting if Alekseev does that. Alternatively, he could play knight e2 and try to reroute this knight to c3. e5 is a very committal move by Arjun, clearly indicating that he is not happy with the status quo and wants to stir the pot a little bit. Knight e2 is on the board. Black needs to keep playing decisively here because now white has a clear roadmap of exerting his control over these light squares. And there it is, b5. Super heads-up move by Erigaisi. He basically had one more opportunity to play that move. If white's knight would have landed on c3, it would have been very difficult for black to shove this move through. So he gets off at the last stop. The train has left the station. Alekseev has to keep an eye on his clock as well. Arjun is the superior blitz player, and that might be a deciding factor in this game if Alekseev doesn't find a way to keep his pawn structure intact. This ain't looking great for white. I think it's time for a bailout. Let's see what Alekseev comes up with. Knight c3. Knight c3 is on the board. hitting the pawn on b5. The computer does not like that move at all, and neither do I. But maybe that's why I'm in the commentator's chair and not in the player's chair. Knight c3 is a logical move on the surface because you're hitting the b5 pawn and you're trying to discourage Arjun from setting the center on fire with d5. The problem with this move is that you're not seriously threatening knight d5. Right? Earlier, you would have established a knight on d5. Here, knight d5 has lost a lot of its luster because Arjun would simply take that knight with his bishop, and white would be saddled with this dud of a remaining bishop on g2. This is not looking good for Alekseev, and he gets the 2 rooks for a queen, right? Just a quick instant replay there. He played f takes e5, d takes e5, and Arjun saw this coming. That's why Arjun has a pawn on h6, so that this is not checkmate. Now, technically, from a material perspective, 2 rooks might be like a point ahead of the queen, but you always have to evaluate 2 rooks versus a queen on a case-by-case basis. And in this case, I feel like Arjun's queen has the ability to trampoline from one side of the board to the other, whereas the rooks are not very well coordinated. So queen a5, maybe even queen c5 can be considered here by black, setting up the threat of b4. And that's exactly what Arjun does. b4 was a huge threat. Now the queen swings over to e3, and now you can see why the rooks can have such a hard time keeping all of the entry points closed. I think Alekseev is trying to trigger a repetition. He has to go back to d2 here. There is no way that white is playing this for a win. I think Alekseev has to play rook e2 quickly, and he's asking Arjun the question, and Arjun says, listen, I'm better. In a classical game, I think Arjun would definitely have gone queen b6 and kept playing. But in the context of a best of 4 where he's won the first game with white, totally logical decision to be okay with the repetition. Now, Alekseev is thinking, but I don't see a single way for him to keep winning chances alive. The only thing he can do is keep losing chances alive, and that is why he very smartly says, nothing I can do, I have to repeat moves. And that puts Arjun 1 point away from taking this first match and claiming his throne, his Division 3 throne. Let's go back to the other game. The other game still very much ongoing. And not just ongoing, but potentially getting really heated in an endgame that looked pretty lifeless to start. So ironically, the game that I thought was going to get super tactical ends up fizzling out in repetition. The game that I thought was going to bail out into a draw is now extremely unbalanced. So let's zoom in. Vidit is up on time. He's got 90 seconds to Grischuk's 30 seconds. He's got a pawn on b6. How did this happen? Alexander Grischuk let this pawn slip down to b6. Now knight a5 is a huge threat. And finally, we got the move knight c4. A little bit later than I expected. Grischuk drops back to d5. He's starting to panic a little bit, trying to keep all of the entry points closed off to white's pieces. Knight a5 here does not work. You do not want to play knight a5 and give up the b6 pawn. That is why Grischuk dropped his knight back to add another pair of eyes and really to babysit this nasty little pawn on b6. Now Vidit needs to find a way to keep the pressure up. Rook b5, excellent move. Fantastic move by Vidit. Look at the nice way that his knight here sits on c4 right in between the trees in amongst these pawns. 12 seconds for Grischuk. Vidit's idea is very clear. He wants to double on the b file. And the moment a knight establishes itself on a5, things are going to get really dicey, potentially decisively dicey for black. Rook to c6, a little trap. You don't want to go knight a5 if you're Vidit, because black plays rook takes b6. Rook a2 apparently is the best move. Wow, what an idea. Rook a2, and then both pairs of rooks are going to be forkable, and yet neither fork is going to be effective. This is winning. Vidit finds it. Rook a7 wins the game. If Vidit plays rook a7, he seals the deal. He can also give a check on a8. Actually, there's more than one path that leads to Rome here. But rook a7 is the most accurate move, winning the game on the spot. Simply not enough time here for Sasha Grischuk, one of the greatest time scramblers in the world. But there's only so much you can do with 4.7 seconds on his clock. 20 seconds for Vidit. He finds rook a7 and rook a8 check. That is the secret sauce. Rook a8 check. He's got to find that move. And okay, he goes for the extra piece instead. Not the most accurate path to converting the advantage. He could have won an entire rook, but this is good enough. This is good enough. He's up a full piece. h5, another excellent move, just fixing black's pawns on attackable squares, much harder to shoot at a moving target. And now he needs to find a way to get his knight around to f5. I think that's the easiest way to win the game. But there is no reason that he should give up any additional pawns. g4, very patient. I think it's resign time. Pretty soon here for Grischuk. Still trying. Knight d5, hitting the rook. Do not blunder the rook here. Rook d7. Grischuk goes back to c3. And now we're going to see Vidit's knight patiently climb its way around to f5. All of black's pawns are falling. And we're seeing the last couple of moves here. Vidit, what a smooth conversion. Bishop takes h6. Another pawn falls. No stalemate ideas. Black has way too many pieces. c4. Grischuk still trying, finding ways to make this more complicated than it seems. Bishop takes f6, but black's pawns are not going anywhere. Meanwhile, knight h6 is mate in 2. And Vidit finds it. Who would have known Vidit would find a mate in 2 moves? Just kidding, of course. What a game. And Vidit, much like his compatriot Arjun 1 point away, just a single point away from claiming the second division, because he came from the winner's bracket. And the back is against the wall. If you're Yevgeny Alekseev, if you're Alexander Grischuk, you need to come through with a powerful performance in these last 2 games, at the very least to force an Armageddon. If Vidit gets a single point in these last 2 games, if Arjun gets a point in these last 2 games, then we will not have a grand final reset in either of our 2 matches, and the winners will be the 2 Indian Grandmasters. Vidit's game, very, very impressive. Just great conversion. It was a back and forth game. Grischuk has to keep his head up, and he'll have a little break to recuperate and set up his match strategy for how he's going to come back and erase this 1-point deficit. Well, my strategy is going to be to refill my coffee because I'm all alone today. But before I do that, wanted to remind you of something called AnyChess. AnyChess is a free-to-play magical chess game from our partners at Animoca Brands, bringing a totally new way to play chess. They've had their daily puzzles for a bit, but did you know that PvP has been in the works? Now you can be among the first to explore the game and influence its development with your feedback. You can join the open alpha waitlist now and act fast because the first 100 using the promo code CCT will be admitted into the private alpha. Use !AnyChess to learn more. That's ANICHESS. If you don't know how to spell chess, well, probably shouldn't be watching this broadcast. Just kidding, of course. !AnyChess or go.chess.com/anychess to join the private open alpha waitlist. And we'll be back with more coverage of the Division 2 and Division 3 final coming right up in just a couple minutes.
Do you show a bunch of different faces to psych your opponents out?
He felt very uncomfortable answering that question.
He's lying, okay.
Do you have a Lee Chess account?
Did you successfully trick the lie detector test at any point in the game?
Huge lie.
Are you really worth $50 million?
Are you intimidated by Magnus Carlsen?
Do you consider yourself a genius?
You know, he tried to dodge the question now.
No way he's telling the truth on that. Do you think cheating is being taken seriously in over-the-board chess? Seriously enough?
Absolutely not.
True.
Do you think the online cheating paranoia is overblown or appropriate?
Tough question. The answer is somewhere in the middle. It's not being taken seriously enough, but there's also too much paranoia.
He's telling the truth.
So let's talk a little bit about that, even though we're moving the pieces. When you say that more could be done, do you have a specific list for Chess.com?
A specific list. I mean, I think there should be a way to look at the performances of players who are not, say, up-and-coming kids specifically. And when you see certain players being defeated consistently, like Nepo or myself or Fabiano, I just think over our careers of having played chess, it seems that sometimes it's happening more frequently than it should, is what I would say. And I don't know how you deal with that, but I do believe it's happening more than it should.
Let's switch it up a little bit. Do you ever sing in the shower?
Not anymore, no.
True.
Are you really worth $50 million?
No.
I don't know. He's made a lot of money on stocks. He might be lying.
Lying.
He's lying. Okay. No, all right. Well, are you the best streamer in the world?
Yes.
No, that's a lie.
Okay. I guess I didn't clarify chess streamer. I should have
Exactly.
clarified chess
Exactly.
streamer. Okay. Are you the best chess streamer?
Yes.
Yes, with some ambiguity.
With some, okay. Yeah, well, there's a lot of context then. All right. I'll let you make a few more moves.
Sure.
I kind of need you to get a good position against me, or it's going to go forever. Okay.
I have this feeling this is not going well. It's making me wonder if I should become a career criminal now.
Okay.
Hundreds of thousands of kids have used the CrunchLabs Build Box to learn how to create and build stuff while having a ton of fun at the same time. But what about something for teenagers and adults, where they can learn all the tools and tricks I use to create the builds on my channel? Well, I'm happy to say, starting today, that exists now. And this is it. It's called HackPack, and it's basically a series of really fun programmable robots that get delivered right to your door, where we build it together and learn step by step the kinds of engineering skills that go into making the builds on my channel. And don't be intimidated, because all these use a programmable microcontroller as the brain. Because if you can put together a Lego set, you can put together this. And it will work right out of the box. No programming required, and it will still be really fun. Heck yeah.
Welcome back to the CrunchLabs Masters. It is the Division 2 and Division 3 final today with Vidit and his compatriot Arjun Erigaisi oh so close to taking the Division 3 and Division 2 titles respectively. Their opponents have to put through a powerful performance in these last two games in order to force a grand final reset, or at the very least to give themselves a chance by forcing an Armageddon. The situation is simple. The two players coming from the losers bracket, Alexander Grischuk and Yevgeny Alekseev, are both down 1.5 to half. If Vidit or Arjun win their next game, they win the match, then everything is all over. If Grischuk or Yevgeny Alekseev can at the very least get to 2 points, that will force an Armageddon. If they win it, they force a grand final reset, which will be another match. But we will cross that bridge if we get there. I think the player in the most trouble right now is Alekseev, because Arjun Erigaisi has been completely unstoppable with the white pieces, as we get a good look there at Vidit. Vidit has black, and we saw that in their first game, Alexander Grischuk was able to exert some serious pressure. He was winning, but it was a miracle save, actually, at the end of the game by Vidit, using Grischuk's time against him. And to exactly the surprise of no one, we have a London system once again by both players. So today is a day of the London system. And what you can notice on the left side there is that Vidit repeated the initial choice of bishop f5, but now drops his bishop back to g6, which is a much more conventional way of handling the position. In the first game, he took on d3, and that gave Grischuk that early central pawn mobility and that early ability to push his e-pawn all the way up to e5. So that's how the position got its sort of Jabava London flavor. On the right side, you can see Yevgeny Alekseev repeating his choice thus far from their first game, where he played c takes d4 and then played the sort of Hikaru variation with the knight dropping off to h5 and pushing the white bishop down to e3. Alekseev was able to grab the bishop pair, and he had a pretty solid position, but he was always slightly worse. But this time he deviates, and he plays what may seem like a rather quizzical move, a6, a bit enigmatic, exactly what he's doing with that move. But the point is to prevent white's light squared bishop, from developing to b5, which in the London system, just like in the exchange Caro-Kann, which, by the way, this position resembles, can be a very nasty idea. Bishop b5 and bishop takes c6, kind of crippling black's queenside pawn structure. So Alekseev is sort of playing against Arjun's bishop on e2. It's a slightly risky strategy. You might be allowing white's queen to move up to b3 and challenge the b7 pawn, but it's kind of a smart positional way of playing. Let's start from our Division 2 final, because moves are coming in fast. Arjun Erigaisi already sort of in the tank, but Alexander Grischuk is playing pretty confidently thus far as we get an exchange on g6. Let's zoom in to our Division 2 final. Alexander Grischuk develops his knight to d2, and already pieces are sort of coming off the board here. And it may not be obvious exactly what white is playing for. Like, is white really contending for an advantage by playing a position this symmetrical? And the answer is yes. Definitely black's position can get very unpleasant from a strategic point of view if Vidit is not vigilant and if he's not careful about the way that he sort of discharges the central tension. And I think one good example of that is bishop takes f4, which I don't think we're going to see. It's actually not totally out of the question that Vidit does trade on f4. But if he trades on f4, I think that he has to follow up by pushing c5, because here you get kind of a shifted Morozzi structure, right? We saw Yevgeny Alekseev with pawns on e4 and c4. Here the pawns are on d4 and f4, kind of a similar concept. This establishes a stronghold on e5. And what you don't want to do if you're Vidit is play a move like knight to c6, right? You're not really recommended to do that in the London with black, because after a move like c3, white can then solidify the other pawn with g3, and then he's got a complete and total clamp on the center. So this is the worst case scenario for black. This would be very cramped. The knight's coming into e5, and white has kind of a clear plan of expanding on the queen side by following Arjun Erigaisi's lead from his first game and using these pawns to expand even further. So instead, Vidit says, I want nothing to do with that. I am going to challenge white in the center immediately, and that is why you want to play c5 ASAP. And he does. Grischuk trades on c5. But okay, I mean, d takes c5 is not really a move that you see all that often in the London, right? Usually you see white playing c3 and maintaining the pawn on d4. Here, Grischuk is treating this position almost like a queen's gambit accepted. All right, d takes c5, and now I think he's going to play c4 and create kind of a new set of challenges for black in the center. So very hard to pin down the way that this game is going. You would not really guess that it came from a London if white plays c2, c4, because we are so used to white's pawn being on c3 in the London. Okay, big moment here. Grischuk brings his rook to d1. Clearly, he is orienting himself toward a central pawn break. Now, whether it's c4 or maybe even e4, that actually remains to be seen. But I gotta say, I'm kind of skeptical. I'm kind of skeptical about the way that he's handling this. He seems to be very confident. But the problem is that even if white plays the move c4, that move doesn't really carry that much weight. C takes d5 will not really be a threat. Black could even potentially capture with the e-pawn. And I think Vidit is a skeptic as well. But so is the computer, except the computer is skeptical of black's last move, not white's position. Knight h5 is a clear indication that Vidit wants to end this match here and now. He doesn't just want to play solid and make a draw. He senses an opportunity to grab the initiative with the black pieces here and potentially seal the deal. If he wins this game, they do not play a fourth game. He will win the match. But is he encouraging Grischuk to push c4? The problem with the move knight h5 is that I'm not so convinced that knight takes f4 is a move that black really wants. Because yes, white's e-pawn repositions to f4 and c4 is on the board. It is true, white plays e takes f4 and gets doubled pawns, and black's bishop might be happy, but just look at this pressure on the d5 pawn. If the queen never gets out of d8, then white has this really nasty idea of knight to b3, opening up an x-ray against black's queen, and then c takes d5 will become a serious threat. So knight h5, very sloppy move, I think, by Vidit, who might have underestimated just how quickly, just how fast and furious white's central pawn storm arrives. Now, a good question here that Vidit should ask himself is, well, can I play d takes c4? Now, can I bite the bullet here, exchange the pawns, and take whatever is coming my way in regards to the queen getting attacked? Is there a serious discovered attack against the queen? That is a big question that black would have to answer if he chooses to play d takes c4. I would be too scared to play this move against Grischuk, but I think Vidit is seriously considering it. Either way, it is very, very clear to me that c4 was underestimated by the Indian Grandmaster, who had a lot of ways that he could have softened the blow. He could have moved the queen away from d8. He could have played queen b6 on the previous move. He could have castled and gotten his king out of the center so that he doesn't have to worry about that now. And black just doesn't have a great way of keeping the situation in the center closed. It's like the water is starting to boil out of the pot, and you keep trying to put a lid on it, but you might not be able to put a lid on it because the water might be coming out. And a couple of sample variations. If he plays knight takes f4, e takes f4, and now plays pawn takes c4, the problem is not that black is going to lose his queen or lose material. I think the problem is largely positional. White might just recapture on c4. And the big problem in this position, let's say black plays queen e7, is white's control over key squares in the center. Knight c to e5 would very likely follow. White is threatening rook d7. The queen is coming to b5. And this bishop on c5 is just kind of sitting there, passively spectating as white surrounds black in the center. And there's nothing that black can do, even as impressive as the bishop may seem to be played. So this might be borderline loss for black. I think d takes c4 is out of the question. If you play the move d4 and try to keep the d file closed, this has another set of problems, right? White has the obvious move knight to b3. You can't move the bishop back because white pushes c5 and the pawn on d4 falls. You see the eval bar rising. So the fact that Vidit has now spent something like 3 minutes and counting on this move, it shows us that he's realized this is a very serious situation. He needs to find a way to opt for the lesser evil, right? He's not going to be able to take care of everything in this position, but at the very least, he has to make sure that the center is intact, that white is not infiltrating down the d file. And obviously, the most important thing here for black is to make sure that the king is able to get out of the center at the right moment. My choice would probably be to castle here. Castle in this very position, maybe knight takes f4 and castles, and maybe just, eat whatever damage comes your way in the center. He does take on f4, and he does take on c4. Wow. So he actually just goes for the most principled continuation. He says, I am not willing to make any concessions in the center. I'm not willing to admit my fault, but this is a very dangerous path. Now, Grischuk is likely to take back on c4. He is going to invest some time calculating knight to e4, which is a tempting move as well, and, a possible candidate move. After knight takes c4, I don't think that Vidit is going to put his queen on e7. As I was kind of illustrating, he is likely to put his queen on c7 or on f6. So maybe his approach is to buy himself a tempo by attacking the f4 pawn. If he can buy himself that one tempo, he will be able to castle and he's completely fine. And Grischuk does play knight e4, and the eval bar shoots back down. And apparently knight e4 is a pretty serious mistake, which might relinquish the initiative. Wow. And now Grischuk starts to think. Now, what's the difference, right? What is the difference between knight e4 and knight takes e4? Why are you just spouting engine assessments, Mr. Commentator? Do you actually understand why one move is better than the other? Well, I think I do. The reason knight takes e4 is so much better, let's say that Vidit plays, let's say Vidit plays the same move, queen c7. In the game, he played queen b6. I'm not going to show queen b6. The problem is that here the knight gets to e5, and I think Grischuk underestimated the power of the move knight e5. The point is not that he plays knight takes c4 in order to restore the material equality. That doesn't matter. What does matter is the knight getting to e5, and the reason that matters is because of the d7 square. That is the real square that he wants to access. So let's say white castles here. Here black loses immediately after knight d7. Immediately, because this is a fork. If Vidit were to take on e5 and then castle, Knight d7 is no longer as effective because the bishop isn't hanging, but rook d7 is now extremely nasty and hard to face. So that is the big difference. Grischuk plays knight e4. He goes the wrong way, and he goes knight fg5. He's going for checkmate here, setting up the threat of knight takes f7 and knight g5. It's a very flashy idea, and he is trying to lure Vidit into castling kingside, which is now suicidal. I mean, there is no way the black castles kingside here. White's queen is going to take approximately 3 milliseconds to reach the h-file, at which point mate on h7 will simply be unstoppable. So there's no way that Vidit is going to cooperate by castling. You can see the blue arrow, which means there is only one correct move here, and Vidit is going to find it because there are simply no other moves. Maybe knight d4 is slightly tempting until you realize that White's queen just takes on c4. Bishop e7 is the only move, but it's a very powerful move because it takes the sting out of this sacrificial idea, knight takes f7 and knight g5. Now, the bishop on e7 is necessary because there you will simply be able to take the other knight and White will run out of attacking fuel. Good job by Vidit to take his time here. He immediately sensed, I think the moment he played knight h5, that the situation required tremendous precision. It also requires him to keep some time on his clock. And the longer he thinks here, the more concerned I get. He's down a minute. Bishop e7 is played. And Vidit has just shown such an ability, such a good sense of danger, right? A sense for when things might start turning against him. And he's been able just to take his time, hunker down, and rattle off a series of accurate defensive moves. But he needs to keep doing it because the situation still, at least to my eyes, looks incredibly dangerous for Black. It's so easy to blunder here. White again is once again threatening knight takes f7. Now this works for a different reason. The queen will be able to lift up to e6. And once again, it's not easy for Black to find a resource. Knight to d4, very tempting move. I think that loses to queen e5. And once again, Vidit finds the computer move. Rook to d8. Cold-blooded. Now, does this blunder mate? It does not. Rook takes c6 here. That doesn't work because after queen takes c6, the knight moves back to e7, and White has no way to continue attacking. Knight takes f7 no longer works here because Black simply takes on f7, and it looks like Vidit might stabilize the situation. But in the meantime, we have to look at the other game because that position has gone haywire as well. Let's go to the two-board view here for just a second. Now, Arjun Erigaisi has one knight, and Yevgeny Alekseev has two, but this is by design. Arjun Erigaisi has sacrificed a piece. If you told me that one of these two players would sacrifice a piece, I would bet a silver dollar that it was obviously Alexander Grischuk because his position was a lot more tactical. But Arjun Erigaisi actually sacrifices his piece for 3 pawns, and I think you can immediately see why that position appeals to him. He's got only one knight, but that one knight might be collectively better than both of Yevgeny Alekseev's knights combined. He has 3 pawns for the piece. Just counting 7 pawns against 4. So he's got 3 pawns for the piece. So it's not really a sacrifice technically. And the main problem for Black is that pawn on a6. How is Alekseev going to defend it? How is he going to keep all of the entry points to his position sealed off? Because in addition to the knight, Arjun has a rook. That rook is going to land on b4. And from b4, it can access b6. And once that rook gets to b6, there will be hell to pay. If Black loses the a6 pawn, Arjun is going to have almost 4 passers on the queen side. That is untenable. And look at the time situation on the right side. Alekseev almost down to a minute. Arjun with 6.5, leaning back in his chair, super relaxed. And on the left side of the board, Grischuk back in familiar territory, desperately looking for ways to keep his initiative alive. But no such method exists. Both players who come from the loser's bracket are in mortal danger. If they lose this game, they lose the match. The match does not go to a 4th game. And Vidit, he's been able to find one accurate defensive move after another. Grischuk on the left side there has to just play rook takes d8 and queen takes c4 and basically admit to the fact that his initiative has fallen through. Vidit should be able to hold a draw. Now, if Vidit draws that game, we do go to a game 4, which would be a must-win for Grischuk with the black pieces. So if he can find a way to keep the flames burning, he should. Rook to d1 there on the board, attacking Vidit's queen. But my eyes are on the right side, as Evgeny Alekseev has found a really nice defensive resource, rook to b8, saying, I'm not the only one with pawn weaknesses. Arjun's pawn on b2. That pawn has to be babysitted. That pawn maybe will move up to b3, but if it moves up to b3, then the c3 pawn is going to be weak. So Alekseev trying to squeeze the most juice out of his pieces, trying to find a good job for his knights. The knight on f6 could jump into e4, which would be a much more effective move if Arjun had a weak pawn on c3 that could be attacked. So hard to find a move, and I like what Grischuk is doing on the left side. If you flicker your eyes over, he's got a rook on d7. Now, he could have gotten a rook on d7 earlier, but better late than never. Now Vidit's queenside pawns are under fire. Vidit has managed to get his king to relative safety on the king side, but relative safety is an exaggeration because White's queen is itching to make its way to the h-file. It'll only take it 2 moves to get there. Queen g4 and queen h4. If a queen gets to the h-file and Vidit is not ready to escape with his king, he will get checkmated. There is no way to cover that h-file. b7 hangs. There's the threat of checkmate. Vidit's rook is stuck on f8 because the f7 pawn has to be supervised. This is suddenly, once again, a very difficult situation for the Indian Grandmaster. I think Grischuk has a serious chance here to win this game, to tie the match, and potentially to force a grand finals reset. On the right side, you can see Arjun Erigaisi. He's taken on a6. Alekseev is under a minute now. Does he have the time to manage these complications? I don't think either of them do. Vidit has played b5, ignoring the threats against his king. And the computer is showing that Grischuk could play queen g4. He could get his queen to the h-file, and the death bells will start to toll here for Vidit if Grischuk can find queen g4. If Grischuk realizes that easy does it. Oh, and there's a rook sacrifice in that game that I'm actually spotting. If Vidit plays rook d8, I actually think potentially Grischuk could even leave his rook hanging on d7 and simply play queen h4. There are some beautiful tactics, but we don't have the time to delve into all of them. Alekseev might be losing this match. Arjun might be just a couple moves away here from securing the third division. 10 seconds for the Grandmaster from Russia, lives in Israel, rook to b8. He drops his rook back, desperately trying to keep Arjun's a-pawn under control. That actually was an excellent move, realizing that passive defense is the only way. And rook takes f7, Grischuk on the left side. He helps himself to Vidit's pawn. That might trigger a queen sacrifice. It does. And now Grischuk has a queen for a rook and a knight, but the game is far from over because Vidit has a 3-on-2 majority on the queen side. So Grischuk has some converting to do. Alekseev has some moving to do. He's under 10 seconds. Drops his knight to d6, using his knights to curb the mobility of White's a-pawn. Now Arjun has to choose the right moment to push a7, and that moment is probably not now. Because if Arjun pushes a7 there on the right side, Black's knight will drop back to c8, and the pawn will be likely surrounded. And he does play a7. He says, I don't care. I'm going to wait for you to say that. I'm going to do it anyway. Instead, Alekseev brings his king over to e7. I didn't think that was the most accurate move. Rook to a6 by Arjun. 5 seconds for Alekseev. There's no way he's keeping this under control forever. He's got 5 seconds with a 2-second increment for the rest of the game. Let's zoom into that game really quickly. Let's watch the final steps. 1 second for Alekseev. He's got to move. He plays knight c7. Arjun playing so quickly, so confidently. He's got 3.5 minutes on his clock. He doesn't need it. Alekseev's going to flag. And he flags. Alekseev flags. And the computer is showing us that after knight t7, Black is still alive. White is only slightly better technically. But how on earth can you defend this position with just seconds left on the clock? Alekseev saw that he couldn't take on a7. He panicked. And we have a winner in Division 3. It is Arjun Erigaisi. He doesn't even need a fourth game. He crushes Evgeny Alekseev. He came from the winner's bracket, and so that match is over. We will not have a grand finals reset in Division 3, and we warmly congratulate the world number 4, Arjun Erigaisi. Both of his white games were commanding. The way that he maximizes the London system is pretty breathtaking, but I think we will get another game in our other match. Let's zoom in. As Alexander Grischuk, he's under a minute. He needs to win this game. Not according to the match situation, a draw will keep this match going, but emotionally, in terms of his real chances at a comeback in this match, he needs to win in order to tie, and then he'll need a successful result in the next game to force a grand final reset. But there's 30 seconds by both players here. This game is not over. How easy is it to mouse slip? How easy is it to miss a fork? If instead he would have gone queen c2, knight e1 would have forked the king and the queen. Now Vidit has to find a way to keep the game alive. He goes to b4. He's basically asking Grischuk, okay, dude, you're up a queen. How are you going to make progress? And I think the key for Vidit is to keep this e6 pawn protected. If he loses the e6 pawn, he loses the game. He can essentially afford to give up the a pawn. Maybe he can even afford to give up the g pawn. And for Grischuk, who's down to 20 seconds, do not give up the b2 pawn. The worst thing that can happen to white here, other than blundering a fork, is if you lose the b2 pawn, black gets massive counterplay because he will then have a pass pawn on a4. Grischuk's not seeing it. Grischuk's been going back and forth. He's floundering. He cannot afford to let this win slip. I don't know what the plan is. I think that he should just start pushing his pawns and hope for the best. Vidit going back and forth, Grischuk advancing his pawns, grabbing some space on the king side. Now, it's very obvious that at some point, white's going to go h5. The question is when? Queen c7 check. Now he can give another check, and he does, buying himself some time. Suddenly, Grischuk is down 10 seconds on the clock. So hard to figure out the right moment here for white to play a move like h5, because you can only do that once. 10 seconds for Grischuk. What does he do? The engine is showing that white is winning, but you should toss that in the trash. Imagine having 7 seconds here. How do you figure this out? Back and forth goes Grischuk. Queen e4 is an excellent move. He's trying to put black in Zugzwang. King f6. Vidit has no fear. He keeps these pawns protected with 5 seconds on the clock. Grischuk, it's time for the breakthrough. f5. But can he make this work? What if Vidit simply plays g takes f5? Grischuk wants to go g5. He takes with the other pawn. Now there's a mate threat. There's a mate threat by Grischuk. He gives a check on f8. This is phenomenal play by Grischuk. Queen takes g7, and he takes another one on g6. Now he's going to start pushing his h-pawn, and still the game isn't over because Vidit is going to try to activate his knight. Vidit should play f2, give up the pawn, and then get his knight into the defense, and he does. Grischuk patiently takes on f3, and I think he's totally winning. As long as Grischuk doesn't miss a fork, as long as he doesn't blunder his h1, he wins this game. But those are two big ifs. And look at the way Vidit is defending. Knight back to e5, still not over. Tons of forks that you have to sidestep here. Rook g6 probably should be tried, but that's a moot point. It's over. It's totally over if Grischuk can avoid blundering his queen here. Queen h4, queen f4, either move wins. 2 seconds on the clock, he plays it. Gives his fans a mini heart attack. h7. That's it. Vidit flags. Grischuk wins. He forces a 4th game, and a little fist bump there. I didn't miss that. Allows himself a very small celebration indeed, and there's no celebrating to do because not only has he not won the match, he merely tied the match, and even if he wins this match, he will have simply another match to play as a reward, and that means all eyes are on the Division 2 Grand Final because Arjun Erigaisi has won in commanding fashion. He's defeated Evgeny Alekseev. We can take a look at the filled-out bracket there. What's funny is that these same two players faced off yesterday in the winners' final. So Evgeny Alekseev, the reason he was in the losers' bracket was because of Arjun Erigaisi. He lost to him once, and today he lost to him twice. What a performance by Arjun, the world number 4. Simply controlling the game from start to finish, showing total command of the London system. And we've had a lot of London systems today. Alexander Grischuk and Arjun both using it as a weapon to play for the win. I think that the way the London has been redefined in recent years, whereas it used to be a drawing weapon, now very much a serious weapon to fight for the advantage. Pretty incredible how this new generation of talent is blazing new trails in openings that used to be considered kind of dead. The London system is a meme, but it's actually a very, very dangerous opening system. And you can see that even very experienced GMs, such as Evgeny Alekseev, he simply did not know what to play against it. He was not able to get out of the opening with the kind of position he wanted. But all kudos to Arjun Erigaisi for his rapid, confident, just tactically explosive play, showing some moxie with the white pieces and taking this match in 3 games. We congratulate Arjun. A nice prize total and the Division 3 throne is his. Vidit seeks to join him, but Alexander Grischuk stands in his way. We now have a fourth game between Vidit and Grischuk. The consolation for Vidit is that he has white. Obviously, he's got less pressure on him if he loses this game. We will go to the grand final reset, which will be a best of 2 match. But obviously, we'll cross that bridge if we get there. The series is tied 1.5, 1.5. If this game ends in a draw, then we obviously go to an Armageddon. And once again, if Grischuk wins the Armageddon, he merely forces a grand final reset. So double Elim is a great format because if you lose a match, you do get another chance, but the path becomes incredibly narrow. You have to basically be perfect, and you have to pull off what seems to be an unimaginable feat. Except we know it is an imaginable feat. Alireza Firouzja was able to do it against Magnus. MVL was able to do it against Magnus, and obviously Magnus himself hasn't done it because he usually isn't in the loser's bracket to begin with. Okay, Alexander Grischuk has stepped away, just maybe filling his coffee cup one last time before this important game. He's clearly not at home. That looks like a hotel bed to me. And of course, perfect lighting, as always, by Alexander Grischuk. These players are traveling, and they don't let that be an excuse not to play. Of course, hotel internet, not the greatest. Often unreliable, but these players will stop at nothing to make their matches and put 100% of their effort in. I hope you're enjoying the coverage thus far as we enter this fourth game of the Division 2 Grand Final between Vidit and Alexander Grischuk. The game will start as soon as Sasha assumes his seating position. Your seatbelts should be fastened. We may hit turbulence. We probably will hit turbulence as soon as the opening. And obviously the big question, what is Vidit going to play? Will he repeat what he played previously, this kind of souped up Catalan with knight c3? It didn't necessarily get him where he wanted to be out of the opening. The position was equal. Later on, they exchanged queens, and Vidit was able to trick Grischuk in a very complicated endgame. But the game was not necessarily won because of the opening. Will Vidit switch to 1e4? I don't think so. I think we are going to see d4. He is going to kind of manage his risk in the opening. But it's impossible to predict what kind of opening we're going to see. For Grischuk, I don't really think he minds a draw. I don't think he minds going into the Armageddon. He's got the black pieces. There is no need to burn all of your bridges and play something crazy against a player as classically trained as Vidit. So once again, if this game ends in a draw, we just go into an Armageddon. It doesn't mean Grischuk loses the match. So we'll see what the respective match strategies are for both players here. Vidit is waiting, twiddling his thumbs. Grischuk just taking care of some last-second business. Alexander Grischuk, what a career this guy has had. Pretty incredible. He's 40 years old. He's only 40 years old, but in a chess context, that seems incredibly old. He became a grandmaster in the year 2000. He became a grandmaster when I was still doing some PP at 4 years old. Alexander Grischuk was already a grandmaster at 17, which was incredibly young for the early 2000s. And once he became a GM, he rose through the ranks very quickly. He got to 2,700. This is his journey to the Division 2 Grand Final. He lost to Fabiano Caruana in that placement match. But after that, he went on a rampage. He defeated Matlikov, Karthikyan, and Jules Moussard, who himself beat Hikaru Nakamura before dropping a match to Vidit. The very same Vidit that he faces now once again. So we had a kind of symmetry between both divisions where we had a rematch between Alekseev and Aragaisi, and now a rematch between Vidit and Grischuk. Then, of course, Grischuk defeated Hikaru Nakamura yesterday in a very tense Armageddon. It was a close game, but Grischuk showing those vaunted time pressure skills time and time again, no pun intended. But now he's got the ultimate challenge. He needs to defeat Vidit not once, but twice. And this is a Vidit who's displayed so much confidence, so much consistency over the last few months. He made his way to the Candidates Tournament by winning the 2023 FIDE Grand Swiss. Who remembers that? He defeated Hikaru Nakamura in both of their games at the Candidates Tournament. It was a very up and down event for Vidit. He had some problems with his nerves. He had some problems with his time management. He lost some painful games to Nepo and Gukesh, but ultimately he can hold his head up high. It was his first candidate's performance, and he scored some really memorable victories, showing that the new crop of Indian talent, Prague, Ukesh, they're not the only cool kids at the party. But it says, hey, what about me? I'm still here. I'm still fighting. And he's definitely not done. I think he's got a great shot to get into the next candidate cycle. And he's a guy who is absolutely capable of beating anybody in the world, as he showed time and time again at the last candidates tournament in Toronto. Okay, it's time to get started, guys. Vidit. Now Vidit's gone up, and now Grischuk sat back down. So they're playing a little seesaw game here. Now, obviously, sometimes a player needs a little bit more time to get ready for the game. And then the other player's like, hey, well, if you're going to take 5 minutes, then you got to give me a chance to brew some more coffee. And on we go. But once Vidit returns to his seat, I think we're going to get started. Hope you're enjoying the coverage here. Division 2 final. I'm GM Daniel Mereditsky, and I'm flying solo for you today. But hopefully the plane is being piloted decently. Hopefully I haven't spilled any coffee on your lap. We haven't hit any thunderstorms. We're about to hit a thunderstorm. This game is going to be awesome. In the meantime, wanted to quickly remind you about CrunchLabs, the sponsor of this CCT event. Chess.com and the famous YouTuber, former NASA engineer Mark Rober have teamed up this time around for the CrunchLabs Masters. CrunchLabs is an educational STEM toy subscription box company. It's available internationally. The Build Box is for kids aged 8 to 12. Build it yourself, hands-on series of toys, and available in the US and Canada. The Hack Pack is for teens and adults. It's an awesome robot and a box kit. Whether you're new to coding or a master coder, doesn't matter. You can get the Hack Pack, and it caters to whatever level of talent and skill you have. And of course, engineering, logic, all of those skills very much connected with chess. Not a surprise that Mark Rober is a fan of chess. Remember, the first 500 people can claim $32 off an annual subscription to either BuildBox or Hackpack. Exclaim CrunchLabs in the chat, or go.chess.com/CrunchLabs to find out more. Thank you to Mark Rober and CrunchLabs, and thank you to Vidit for playing 1e4. And no thank you to Alexander Grischuk for responding with the French. I'm not thanking him for that. Actually, I'm not thanking Vidit either, because we have an exchange French, which of course is memed upon all the time. But once again, just like the London system, and just like a lot of these openings, the Berlin, which historically are considered ways to fight for a draw and to try to force, any intrigue off the board, that's kind of changed recently. And the exchange French can be played as a weapon to play for the win. It is not necessarily an opening you play just to get all the pieces off the board. And I think Vidit definitely does not want a quick draw here. There's no reason that he would want to force the Armageddon. He's got the white pieces. And we'll see what he can come up with here. So far, the game moving along pretty standard lines. C3 is a sort of standard move for white in the exchange French, trying to limit the activity of this knight on C6 that I've highlighted. The other set of ideas for white involves playing C2, C4, almost treating it like an exchange Caro. And Queen C2, very sneaky move by Vidit. This is like some pretty advanced home cooking. But Grischuk's just developing his pieces. Grischuk's being Grischuk right now. He's playing a setup that's often recommended in books on the French. He actually might castle queenside here, and I wouldn't be surprised if he does. And I'm starting to become a little bit skeptical here. If this is not deep preparation by Vidit, could he have entered some territory that he didn't really sign up for? He plays the exchange French, hoping for kind of a small but stable advantage. Instead, Grischuk is playing a line that I've seen recommended in a lot of books on the French. And it's an old setup. His idea is to play Queen D7 and to basically tell Vidit, hey, I didn't commit to castling kingside. What, you're going to play Queen C2 and Bishop D3? I was born yesterday. I'm going to go kingside castle and give up this H7 pawn. So the obvious remedy for that would be to play H6 and then castle kingside. But Grischuk wouldn't be Grischuk if he didn't play a thug life move like Queen to D7. I don't like what's happening to Vidit here. He plays H3, Bishop to F5 by Grischuk. What is Vidit doing? Now, if anybody's better, I think it's going to be black. I think Grischuk is going to castle kingside. And what's the big stink about castling queenside? Why is that so good for black? Well, the reason's simple. White has no choice but to castle kingside. White does not have the choice of where to castle. Just logistically, it's going to be very hard to get this bishop out in time. And even if you do, you've already got a pawn on c3. So white's queenside situation is going to be a lot worse than black's. I actually think Vidit's last move is a really good one, trying to get his knight into e3, trying to make it difficult for Grischuk to gain more territory in the center. But the problem is that black is just very quickly going to send his pawns up the board. So I'm just going to show a sample line to kind of show people how bad things can get if white just goes headfirst into the opposite side castling situation. So if instead Vidit had castled, and let's say Grischuk does the same, the problem is that basically black's pawn storm is a lot more effective than white's. Usually white goes with something like b4. Let's say black trades on d3 just for the sake of illustration, and then black will play the move f6 in order to prepare a quick march of the g-pawn. And if we compare the march of the b-pawn and the march of the g-pawn, b5 is a completely innocuous move. Black can meet it with knight a5. On the other hand, the moment black's pawn lands on g4, there is hell to pay. And it's largely because Vidit has a pawn on h3. But even if he didn't have a pawn on h3, this would still be a very undesirable scenario for white to allow. If the g-file opens up, the game is basically over. Black gets the rook to g8. Now, this is the kind of thing Vidit wanted to avoid, and that is why he took great pains to first get his dark squared bishop out of the game, out of the gate, I should say. And after a long thing, Grischuk decides, I don't really want to castle queenside anymore, which is a pretty reasonable decision. He plays queen f5, and I think he's showing us that he probably does not mind an Armageddon. And by the looks of it, neither does Vidit. He takes on f5, kind of takes the off-ramp, and sadly, we might get opposite side castling, but if we do, it will not be for the purposes of generating attacks on either side of the board. But I think black can probably play this. I think if any side is playing this for a small advantage, it's probably Grischuk. He has a space advantage. Vidit has some awkwardness here on the light squares on the queen side. You know, there's potential ideas of the black knight coming into c4. And obviously, black has just better placed pieces in general. So as symmetrical as the structure may seem, there is no reason for Sasha to just accept a draw here. He should play this out. He should absolutely play this out. And let's see. King d7, preparing rook e8. So far, very logical moves. And actually, Vidit does castle queenside. I'm not a betting man, but if I was, I would have definitely bet against seeing white castling queenside in this game. But these are the only circumstances under which it's acceptable. Black doesn't have a queen on the board, which, by the way, does not mean that Grischuk will not try to get an attack going eventually. I mean, he could play a move like b5 or a5. He could still try to attack in the endgame, but it's not very feasible to expect anything resembling a serious attack on white's king, especially because with the e-file being open, white can essentially exchange as many heavy pieces as he wants. He can play rook e1 now, which I think is on Vidit's radar. Instead, he plays knight e1. Very active chess by the Indian Grandmaster, and I'm just giving him a hard time. I actually think that's an excellent defensive move. He is inviting Grischuk's rook into e2, but that's a falsely appealing move because rook e2 doesn't actually do all that much. It simply attacks this f-pawn, and that's why Vidit went knight e1. He went knight e1 to get the knight to d3, and if Grischuk doesn't pay attention and plays a move like rook e8, suddenly, after a move like knight e3, the rook on e2 is actually trapped. And it can't be easily attacked, but this is still not a scenario that you necessarily want to allow if you're Grischuk. For example, white can go king b1 and knight c1. There's absolutely no reason to play with fire in this way. Once again, this is not strictly speaking a must-win game. If they make a draw, we go to an Armageddon. The Armageddon, of course, will be must-win, both in the sense that it's an Armageddon, but also in the grander sense that Grischuk has to win this match in order to force a grand final reset. He comes from the loser's bracket, and the reason for that is that he lost to a guy named Vidit. Familiar? Knight c to e7. So slow-moving endgame. Kind of a slow burn, Jonathan Nolan type thing. It's like Oppenheimer. It takes 2.5 hours to get started, but, you know, the last 30 minutes are pretty interesting. I think this kind of game often takes a while to get off the ground as an endgame. It looks pretty symmetrical, and of course, it might fizzle out pretty quickly, but there's a million ways that things could get interesting. Grischuk could decide to start burning some bridges. He could play f6 and g5, and he can say, I think Vidit's playing too passively. I'm going to go for it. Or Vidit could potentially try to punish Grischuk for overpressing. So either we trade off all the pieces in the next couple moves and it's a quick draw, or one of the sides, which in this case is likely to be black, who I still think is a little bit better, decides to spice things up, either with a pawn break, such as b6 and c5, or a rook infiltration to e2, which will make things a little bit more tactical. Or I think the likeliest is Grischuk tries to shove this pawn through to g5 and ultimately create a passed h-pawn. We'll see. Good time for me to sip some coffee. Slow moving game. b6. Okay, I think Grischuk is hinting at c5. And now the big moment. Of course, he can play c5 in a bit. He can procrastinate. But I think it's pretty clear that Grischuk is at the very least entertaining the prospect of unbalancing the central pawn structure. And funnily enough, we actually already had hanging pawns. It came from a completely different opening, right? In that Catalan, Grischuk did have pawns on the d file and the c file. And ultimately, those pawns cost him the game. So the big question, the move that Sasha is evaluating right now and in the future is c5. Now, what's going to happen if you play c5? What are the pros and cons of that move? Well, let's put it on the board. Let's see what happens. c5, I don't like it. I don't think it's a serious winning attempt because after dc-bc, the virtues of this pawn structure is pretty clear. You know, black can try to go d4 and black is grabbing space, but these pawns are also a massive liability. And I think the reason Vidit put his knight on g2 is not to put the knight on f4, but actually to put the bishop on f4. And by the way, this is what Grischuk's last move is aimed against. He just put his knight on g6, allowing Vidit to exchange some pieces. This does not look like an appealing position at all. The d-pawn is under fire. You can see the eval bar going up. And the other big problem in the long run is that the a-pawn is also isolated, and white can attack it pretty easily by getting the other knight to b3. So Grischuk decides against it. He plays knight g6. That gives Vidit an opportunity to swap some pieces, knight e3. It's a trade. And now the position is starting to really fizzle out because c5 is no longer a serious idea. Obviously, now it would simply blunder the pawn. Vidit is potentially trying to jump into f5 with his knight, but it's important to understand that all of these types of moves are just one-move threats. They're not serious attempts at complicating the game. Like a move like knight f5, you might see it played, but Vidit is not playing it to claim the initiative. He's playing it to buy himself a tempo to go rook e1 and exchange all the pieces. So I think a draw at this point is a very likely result. Now, Vidit is not... Grischuk is not responding quickly. Bishop f8, I think, is the most tempting move, but he can also defend this pawn tactically, and he does exactly that. Excellent move. Knight e7, just showing you how tactically alert these top players always are, even in such a lifeless endgame. And it is a lifeless endgame. This has been an extremely boring game. I'm going to be straightforward here, but even in an extremely boring game, you have tactical subtlety being displayed. Knight takes g7, obviously simply drops a piece to rook g8. And technically, much like in the Magnus Nepo game from yesterday, white could then claim two pieces for a rook. But in this type of situation, with most of the files closed, the rook is much inferior to the two pieces. The knight can very easily chisel its way into white's position. Vidit is not even thinking about it. He drops his knight back to e3, and this is an implicit draw offer. I think if Grischuk goes back to g6 with his knight, which I would heavily doubt that he'll do, because he's not the one risking here. He still has a little pull. Vidit will likely repeat moves with knight f5. Time situation, not yet concerning for Grischuk. Okay, if he had 20 seconds in this position, I would start getting worried. But with 4 minutes, that is more than enough time to figure out a position as simple as this one. Knight g8. Indicating that he's actually trying to defeat Vidit here. He wants to get his knight to e4. And as long as he's not risking too much, he's going to keep this game going. Knight f5 once again, and now it's probably... No, he goes for the repetition. Knight e7. I was expecting him to go bishop f8 and try to get his knight to the e4 square. Instead, I think he's pretty intent on getting an Armageddon here, but we'll see. Knight e7 repeats for the third time. So Grischuk can make a draw. In that case, we go to an Armageddon. Or he can go bishop f8 and keep playing this incredibly colorless endgame. He goes, much to the relief of everybody, for the former option. He goes for the repetition. That means we have more chess to play, and that means we have an Armageddon, which is a win or go home Armageddon for Sasha Grischuk. The match is tied 2-2 in regulation. It's overtime. We will play an Armageddon. The players will bid for their time, and you know the drill. Black gets draw odds, which means if the game ends in a draw, Black takes the game and the match. If White wins, and if White in this case will be Vidit, and if Vidit wins the Armageddon, he wins the entire thing. If he loses the Armageddon, we will have more chess to play. We will have the grand final reset, which will be a best of 2. It's time for a break. The players will bid for their time here at the CrunchLabs Masters. The Division 2 final still ongoing. Don't go anywhere. We'll have an Armageddon between Vidit and Grischuk on the other side of this short break.
How often do you think about the Roman Empire? This July, you can think about it every day while you battle some of the ancient world's greatest and most fearsome leaders. Augustus, Hadrian, Cleopatra, Caligula, and of course, Julius Caesar. Play them all on Chess.com.
Introducing Chess Events by Chess.com, the brand new app that helps you stay up to date with the latest tournaments and results of the most important games. Get breaking news, tournament updates, live stream coverage, results of your favorite players, or a specific matchup you're excited for. Never again miss a tournament's final outcome, a critical moment, or news recaps by the world's top chess journalists. Chess Events makes it easier than ever to bring the chess world to you. Download the app today.
Hundreds of thousands of kids have used the CrunchLabs Build Box to learn how to create and build stuff while having a ton of fun at the same time. But what about something for teenagers and adults, where they can learn all the tools and tricks I use to create the builds on my channel? Well, I'm happy to say, starting today, that exists now. And this is it. It's called HackPack, and it's basically a series of really fun programmable robots that get delivered right to your door, where we build it together and learn step by step the kinds of engineering skills that go into making the builds on my channel. And don't be intimidated, because all these use a programmable microcontroller as the brain. Because if you can put together a Lego set, you can put together this. And it will work right out of the box. No programming required, and it will still be really fun. Heck yeah.
I'm super happy now to announce the Create Your Own course for 2024, where we encourage everyone from the Chessable community to participate, to write their own course, and maybe become the next winner. And winner chicken dinner, that's what you wanna be. Of course, there is a lot of joy in creating a course, but even sweeter is when you are standing on the podium, because winner $5,000, and also second and third will get $3,000 and $2,000 respectively. So this is looking like an ultimate deal as far as I'm concerned, and you can tell I'm super excited to get through those courses to pick out the winner, which I am going to present very, very proudly. So what's there? What do you need to know in order to get started? First of all, you need to have a Chessable Pro membership. Kind of goes without saying that Chessable Pro membership has a lot of perks already. I am sure that many of you already are Chessable Pro members, but if you are not, here is now another reason for you to upgrade your membership to access all the many perks of Chessable. Be mindful of the fact that there is a deadline associated with this Create Your Own course contest, and that deadline is the 19th of October. So you definitely would like to get the ball rolling. Go to chessable.com/create, and I can't wait to collaborate with you.
Welcome to the most exciting format in chess, Armageddon. The ultimate tiebreaker. Armageddon grants white more time on the clock, but in return, white must win. A draw secures black the match win. White starts with 10 minutes, and each player submits a confidential bid with an amount of time they are willing to start with. Lowest bid gets to choose their color, usually black, and those coveted draw odds. Let the Armageddon commence.
Some very audacious, bodacious bids by both of these players. Vidit will have the black pieces with 7 minutes and 14 seconds on his clock as he bids only 10 seconds under Alexander Grischuk, who bids 7 minutes and 24 seconds. How the players arrived at these numbers, you never know. But how these numbers and how these bids always seem to be within just a couple seconds of each other is pretty wild. Okay, the stage is set. Vidit will have the black pieces and draw odds, which means if the game ends in a draw, Vidit takes the game and he takes the match and he wins the second division. If Grischuk wins with white, he wins the game and he forces and triggers a grand final reset. It's underway. Let's get to the game. Moves are coming in really quickly. Now, for folks who haven't seen an Armageddon before, you're in for a treat. Let's get to the game. I can see some moves coming in. And we have the opening, another London system to the surprise of exactly no one. Alexander Grischuk simply repeating the opening, which has worked for him thus far this match. Remember, there is no increment. So the regular time control is 10 minutes and 2-second increment. Here, the increment is taken off the table, as it always is in Armageddons. That means flagging is encouraged. Flagging is often a decisive factor in these Armageddon games. In the early going, Grischuk puts his knight on c3, and he did this kind of thing in their first game, showing kind of the modern treatment of the London system, which does not always involve putting a pawn on c3. And for the second time, he's got a pawn on h6, right? This is eerily reminiscent of how that first game went with Alexander Grischuk. Remember his rook climbing up to g3. And in that game, Vidit had castled kingside, and here he does that again. Now, the point of putting a pawn on h6 here for Grischuk is not that he's going to start the attack immediately, but later on in the game, when things kind of open up, he hopes that the pawn on h6 will ultimately bring him dividends. But right now, the ball is in Grischuk's court. The ball is very much in Grischuk's court because Vidit's plan is clear. Vidit will play b5. He will very likely play knight d7 to b6, and he will start to develop an attack against White's king. So paradoxically, even though White has more space and White was the first to the party, Black has an easier way of prosecuting the attack against White's king than vice versa. So Grischuk has to invest some time here and figure out how he's going to keep putting pressure and where on the board he's going to play. Now, typically in the Jabava London, this type of position is much more reminiscent of a Jabava London where the knight is on c3 in the initial stages. You often play a move like knight e5. You often play a move like bishop g5 in order to keep as much tension alive in the center as possible. He does play bishop g5. Vidit immediately walks his bishop back to e7. Very logical move. I mean, clearly Grischuk was preparing the move e4. Now, White could still consider the move e4, but all that would really do is lead to a bunch of trades. And not only would it lead to a bunch of trades, I think e4 might be a blunder here. And I'm very quickly going to show why. Not really a blunder, but the point is after knight takes e4, bishop takes e7, and this is actually really important. If Black takes on e7, White is much better. And this is, by the way, why Grischuk has paused here. He is calculating e4, I can guarantee you. But Black has this intermediate move, knight takes f2, and that's still not the end of the story. If White takes the queen, White is simply a pawn down, but White can slide the queen to a3, leading us down the road to total chaos. Both players will be in the forest, as Mikhail Tal said, where 2 + 2 = 5, and there's only a path wide enough for one person to return. If I'm Alexander Grischuk and I need to win, maybe you press the chaos button, as Tanya would say, and play e4. If the pawn appears on e4, well, 13 moves later than it should have, because e4 on move 1 is best by test. e4 on move 13 might be the next best thing, but you don't spend, essentially all of your time advantage in an Armageddon unless there is something very important to calculate. It's clearly e4. That can be the only thing that Grischuk is putting his mind to. Now, if he doesn't play e4, the other big problem is that Black's next move is either b5 or even c5. And black's attack is coming fast and furious. So my vote is e4. I just don't see another way for Grischuk to create the sufficient level of tension and tactical complexity. Otherwise, Vidit knows exactly what he's doing on the queen side. If he's able to get b5 and c5 in, and white starts to get attacked, Grischuk lost a similar Armageddon to Fabiano Caruana earlier in the very early stages of this CCT. So I think e4 will happen. Grischuk is now down on time. So the advantage that you start with that compensates for the fact that black has draw odds has been erased. That means Grischuk needs to win this on the board. He's down to 6 minutes with no increment. He's spending now 3 minutes or so calculating e4. Now, what is he actually looking at there? The position after queen a3, yeah, try evaluating that in your head. I was looking at the position having made the moves on the board, and I had no idea what was going on. Who was better? Is one side winning? Grischuk has to calculate all of this in his head, and he's got to decide between that line and maybe other moves that he's thinking about, like bishop takes f6. The computer is showing that the top move here is knight to d2. I can give you a guarantee that this is not going to happen. Knight d2 was not on my radar at all. You can play bishop takes f6 and then play... Oh my gosh, and he plays it! What a moment, he plays knight d2. But I wouldn't celebrate too hard if you're a Grischuk fan, because this is not a sign that he likes his position. This is a sign that he dislikes his position very strongly. Wow, knight d2, enigmatic move by Grischuk. Well, let me tell you what the point of this move is. This is such a deep move. Basically, he's preparing e4, and he's adding another pair of eyes to the e4 square. But the reason I thought this move so unlikely is I was so attached to this knight potentially landing on e5 that moving the knight back in the direction opposite from the ideal square is a sign that you don't like your position. But I think Grischuk is preparing e4, and he believes that he has to carry this pawn breakout at all costs. And let's see, will he play e4? Vidit, of course, no, he plays f3. Grischuk still preparing it. I don't like what's happening here, because now Vidit can play c5. And this is what I talked about. If he can play b5 and then c5, and he can do that while maintaining the integrity of his central pawn structure, Grischuk might simply be too late to the party. He might not be in time to create the kind of pressure and momentum that he wants to with e4. If you give Grischuk one more move and he's able to play e4, okay, then the situation becomes more complicated. Although I should say, even if he did play e4 and Vidit put his pawn on c6, even there I was not too enthralled with white's position. The knight drops back to d7, both sides at approximately 5 minutes. Things are starting to get a little more tactical as Grischuk, he's playing this a lot more slowly than I expected. I was expecting a pawn to land on e4 faster than I could say a pawn would land on e4, but he still hasn't played it. He's making all the necessary preparations, crossing his T's and dotting his I's, and so is Vidit. Vidit's playing rook c8. Vidit's play here is pretty simple. He's getting his pieces into the action. He's essentially waiting for Grischuk to play e4. We know this move is likely to happen at some point, but Grischuk keeps procrastinating, and e4 in the previous position could have been met with e5 followed by d4. This is what I think deterred him from playing it on the last move. He brings his knight back to e2. He's restored a small time advantage, which is really encouraging sign for Grischuk. With no increment, he cannot do what he normally does. He starts playing quickly, c3. Now e5 by Vidit seems pretty automatic. But the Indian Grandmaster playing this very conservatively. Rook f to e8, excellent defensive move. Making sure that the bishop on e7 is protected. You never know when that's going to come in handy. Now, obviously, if you're Vidit, you don't move this knight away under any circumstances, because then you get mated on g7. And finally, you can see that this pawn on h6 is paying some dividends in the sense that it paralyzes Vidit's knight on f6. This knight is essentially pinned. But not to the bishop on e7, rather to the king in kind of a tactical sense. And Vidit says, no problem. I'm happy to keep my knight on f6. That knight is covering all of the avenues to his king. That knight on f6 is well protected. That knight will not go gentle into that good knight, and neither will Vidit as he plays a5, continuing to tighten the screws And Grischuk just kind of continues to accumulate his forces in the center. It feels like the players, this entire game, this entire middle game, I should say, are preparing for something to happen in the center, and nothing is happening yet. And if nothing happens in the center, that favors Vidit, because there is another side of the board that Vidit is operating on called the queen side. And something is definitely going to happen on the queen side if nothing happens in the center. Now, queen a6, you know what that blue arrow means. It means the computer believes queen a6 is a very important move to play. Why is it an important move to play? Because it actually targets the knight on e2. Looks like the least relevant piece on the board, and yet it's not protected. Instead, we have king f8 by Vidit. That's not a great sign. I feel like suddenly Grischuk has been able to exert further pressure on this knight on f6. Vidit just kind of keeping the status quo. And if you notice the situation on the queen side, now b4 is no longer a possibility. a4 was a terrible move by Vidit. Now he can essentially never break through on the b file. He goes rook c6, but suddenly Grischuk finds the perfect opportunity to play e4. And the tables have turned completely. Black has gotten nothing going on the queen side. Absolutely nothing. In fact, negative. White is using the queen side to his favor. Grischuk's knight on c2 can jump to b4 at the right moment. He's got this massive pressure going against Black's minor pieces. The center is starting to collapse. Vidit is still down a minute on the clock. But I don't think time is the deciding factor here. But can Grischuk prosecute the tension in the center successfully? Remember, this is an Armageddon game. Grischuk has to win it in order to force a grand finals reset. He's got the white pieces here. He's got 30 extra seconds on his clock, and his play could not be easier. The knight is coming to e4. Crunch. Oh, look at that pawn on h7. Now Vidit's regretting moving his king away from g8. But an excellent defensive move by the Indian Grandmaster, f6, protecting the g5 square. It's a move played out of necessity rather than out of desire. Rook to d2. Continuing to twist the knife, tightening the screws, using both sides of the board. Really instructive the way that Grischuk keeps switching between the center and the king side, preparing to double rooks on the d file. And not only is Black's position sort of actively collapsing, but White's play is really simple here. Like, all of Grischuk's moves can be played largely without calculating, which means his time advantage is going to keep building up unless he burns it all down. Knight to e3 here. Simple and powerful, restricting Vidit's knight. Playing boa constrictor chess is Grischuk. Look at the way that these knights are positioned in the center on the e-file, controlling all of the key business squares. Vidit trying to keep the Roman Empire together, but it's falling apart. Rook c to d1. Infiltration seems imminent. f5. Vidit tries to complicate the game, hitting Grischuk's knight, but the knight merely repositions onto an even more powerful square, knight to g5. And you also have this beautiful queen swing from h4 to b4. I mentioned that when Vidit played a4, it dried up the situation on the queen side. It didn't allow him to break through. But even more than that, the pawn on b5 is now a serious target. Instead, Grischuk trades the knights, also sufficient. Black is now completely lost. The knight on g5 dominating the king side, the rook dominating the center, and the queen needs to find a suitable role. If you're Grischuk, you're probably just dropping it back to f2 and moving it over to d2, setting up a triple on the d file. You might need a AAA battery to energize Black's position here, because Vidit, he's got no counterplay. Grischuk just needs to parry the one-move threats here, but Grischuk taking a lot of time as usual. He believes that the position is so winning, he doesn't need more than a minute to convert it. But with no increment, he's got to keep an eye on the clock. Vidit is such a resilient defender. He will not budge. He will keep that knight on d7 as long as he can. The moment the knight moves away from d7, which I think it now has to, the game is over because the rook comes to d8. All hands on deck for Vidit. And can Grischuk find the crusher here? Can he find the decisive blow? And does he even need to? Rook to d6, another excellent move. The knight's coming into e6. Then it's moving up to g7. Last chance attempt at counterplay by Vidit. He plays e4. He creates a pass pawn. Grischuk simply blockades it. Just notice with what class Grischuk is playing. He's taking tactics out of the equation. He doesn't need to calculate anything. But at some point, he's got to find the decisive blow. Rook takes d7 was a winning move there, but it was hard to spot. The game isn't over. You can sense the nerves by Grischuk, but I think he can just take on e4. Then Vidit will play rook fe6. And at that point, you have to do some calculation. I'm positive that white has multiple ways to win the game. A Grischuk move here would be queen to d4. Queen to d4 would be the non-tactical way of converting this advantage. But we know that in these types of situations, the player in the must-win situation often panics. He doesn't find a win that suits his needs, a win that's clean enough. He looks at the clock, 90 seconds, tick, tick, tick. And Grischuk is not among the players who panics in these situations. He's too experienced. He's too under control. This is exactly how he beat Hikaru yesterday in the Armageddon. Boa constrictor chess, moving the queen out of the x-ray and setting up the threat of knight takes e4. I think we are seeing Vidit's last couple of attempts here to complicate the game. He might try e3. He tries rook f5, trying to lure Grischuk into the check on h8. And that check on h8 is very tempting, but it doesn't really do anything because Vidit will drop his rook back to f8. It's not over. Grischuk is down to a minute. There's no increment. He has to leave himself with a little bit of time just to convert a totally winning position, to convert an extra queen. And he repeats moves once, trying to milk some time off Vidit's clock. Vidit is like, wait a second, now I don't have to repeat because his rook on f8 is better placed than it was on f6. That's the thing. But he does repeat. And now Grischuk's clock continues to tick. Where's the win? How can this not be cleanly winning? Apparently, the easiest win here is knight to e6, but that is anything but an easy move. Instead, we have a check, and Grischuk shifts his rook to f1. And this is still winning, but it's not as clean. Can Vidit keep this game going? Maybe e3 can be tried. Maybe e3 can be tried. No, because then queen h8 and rook takes f5. That is Grischuk's idea. He's not merely going for the f5 pawn. He is trying to set up queen h8 check, force the knight to pin itself, because that's the only legal move, and then take on f5. It's a genius idea. I don't see a move for Vidit. And the bigger problem is Vidit doesn't see a move for Vidit. He's down to 35 seconds. He probably is the better time scrambler. He tries e3, but I think queen h8 and rook takes f5 finally seals the deal for Grischuk. He'll have to find a mate there, though. He'll have to hunt Black's king down, because Vidit is going to play e2. He's going to throw away the knight, and he's going to force Grischuk to find the forced mate. He should just play e2, close his eyes, and pray. And he does exactly that. And Grischuk will not answer his prayers. Queen d4, retreating with the queen. Ding dong, the Black king is dead. We will have another match on our hands. It's mate in 3. Rook f6 and queen d4 mate. And Alexander Grischuk comes through clutch once again. He wins the second Armageddon in a row. He did this yesterday to defeat Hikaru Nakamura. And we are not done here, says Alexander Grischuk. He comes from the loser's bracket. He avenges his earlier loss to Vidit. He lost to Vidit a couple of matches ago. And he says, I ain't done. He was losing in this match as well. He was down 1.5. His back was against the wall. He won the 3rd game. He drew the 4th game, and now he wins an Armageddon that did not seem to be going his way, to put it mildly, to start the game off. Vidit unable to find a way to get his queenside attack underway. He procrastinated too long. Grischuk found a chance to play e4, and flawless execution by the Russian Grandmaster. What a game, what a clutch performance, but now he's got to reset, and he's got to do it all over again. We're going to go on a break and give these players a much-earned breather. Before we do, we wanted to remind you that if you're among the number of people watching the stream without subscribing on Twitch, of course, there's nobody who's not a subscriber. You are missing out. Now, not only does your subscription make our streams possible, it also unlocks exclusive new emotes for every event, like the Mark Rober emote, plus access to exclusive break time content during the show. You can even use your Amazon Prime to claim a free subscription. So use !subscribe in chat now to level up. Well, there's no leveling up for Alexander Grischuk to do because he's already leveled up. He has shown the next level of skill and the next level of clutch, and he's got to do that again. The winner of Division 2 will be decided in another match. That match will happen right after this break at the CrunchLabs Masters. I'll be right back.
Casablanca for this special tournament. You'll be playing games from interesting positions from historical games. So this is a challenge we want to give you, the players, to see if you know your classics and also more modern games. And as you see, we have switched the normal pieces out with checkers pieces. And you are allowed to get a hint. I can reveal a specific piece.
Oh, that's easy.
But the problem is, who's it against? This is the problem. Who is this against?
Yeah, Marshall, Janowski Marshall?
Correct.
Queen G3, yeah.
Do you remember the year?
08?
1912. Close.
Well,
yeah.
okay, yeah.
Very good. That took you only a few seconds. That was impressive.
Yeah, I don't remember. Like somebody against Marshall, the famous Queen G3.
Correct. And do you remember the year?
I don't know, like 1912, 1911.
1912, correct. So it was Marshall with the black pieces against Stepan Levitsky playing the white pieces.
Yeah, I don't know why I can't remember this. This is obviously the Marshall game, the one where they put the coins on the table in the story, but I don't remember who it was against actually.
But do you remember the year?
The year of this game. No, I don't actually.
1912.
1912.
And it was against Stepan Levitsky.
There are two things that pop into my mind, and it feels like this is either one of those games between, like, I think Botvinnik and Capablanca, or this is Magnus and Vichy.
Yeah, this is easy as well. It's my game against Anand from the match in Chennai, the 9th game.
Feels like my game with Magnus, but
Yes, correct.
yeah.
From 2013.
Well, that's the first thing I thought of, but
Yeah.
then I thought they won't be that mean. But they are. Okay. So.
I'll tell my colleague who sent me this.
I'm gonna think that this is Magnus and Vichy. This would have been the match, and I'm gonna say it's Magnus against Vichy. I'm gonna say that that was the match. He won in 2013. So this would have been the first one because that's when there was all the big cheering and celebration. So this would have been 2014. I'm gonna say this was game 9 of the match in 2014, but maybe I'm wrong. Magnus and Vichy.
It is Magnus and Vichy. Magnus won, but it's the match from 2013, and it's November 21st. So it
Wasn't the candidates in 2013? Oh, the match was the same year?
Yeah. So
I didn't realize that. Okay.
they played in
So I was right,
Chennai
but I had the year
2013,
wrong.
and then in Sochi 2014. But you're correct.
Really?
Welcome back to the CrunchLabs Masters, the Division 2 and the Division 3 final taking place today. Well, the Division 3 final has already taken place, and it was a total drubbing as Arjun runs over Yevgeny Alekseev to take the cake in Division 3. But Division 2 has been anything but a drubbing. It's been back and forth, and Alexander Grischuk has come through clutch, defeating Vidit and making his way from the loser's bracket, forcing a grand final reset. He's won the grand final. That means that Vidit and Grischuk take each other on one more time. Vidit came from the winner's bracket, so he gets a second chance. And the only thing that you have to know about this grand final reset, same format as the grand final, only difference, it's a best of 2, which means the first player to 1.5 points, or obviously 2 points, takes the cake. The time control is the same, and in case of a tie, we go to another Armageddon, and that Armageddon format will also be exactly the same. But let's cross that bridge if we get there, because we've got 2 rapid games to play. Alexander Grischuk, we could see the emotion after he won the Armageddon. Now, an emotional chess player is just one who pumps his fists and then gets ready for the next game. A consummate professional and an experienced professional, Alexander Grischuk, is impervious to pressure. He came through clutch. It looked like the Armageddon game was in the toilet at some point. He was down on time, and somehow he found a way to create the sufficient level of complexity to get his attack started, and then it was a flawless conversion. But Vidit isn't panicking. Vidit knows that he's got another chance. The slate is cleaned. It's a new game. It's a new match. And if you're coming from the winner's bracket, yeah, it's disappointing. Vidit was also up 1.5 in that match. He was perhaps a couple of accurate moves away at several points in the match from taking the cake. But it didn't happen. And he knows that the side that loses this first match needs to do the psychological work. Magnus Carlsen was mad at himself and lost a second time to Alireza Firouzja. Alireza also beat Hikaru twice in the same type of format in the Bullet Chess Championship. So if you're coming from the winner's bracket, it can be hard to perform that mental reset and start the match with a cool mind and a clear head and essentially get rid of the tilt that follows you from the previous match. Well, speaking of following from the previous match, Alexander Grischuk is saying, I've won with the London system twice now. He's gotten good positions very consistently, and I'm surprised that Vidit keeps repeating this bishop f5 move. Now, sometimes you see players being very eager to change up their openings when they sense that things aren't working out. Vidit's a proud guy. He's very well prepared in the opening. He's armed to the teeth, and he keeps playing this bishop f5 setup. Now, he's deviated once again with the move e6, and now, again, Grischuk has shown a complete unwillingness to play this position along traditional London system lines, which would dictate that you have to play c3 and knight e5. Instead, Grischuk almost plays this like a Queen's Gambit declined. It does not look like a London system at all anymore. And we've already seen this structure, right? The game that Grischuk won, the third match game, Grischuk won because he was able to push c4 at the right moment. He created pressure in the center, forcing Vidit's king to the king side. But I want to remind you that in that game, we had an exchange of pieces on g6, which is what allowed Grischuk to set up this mating combination with a knight on g5 and a queen on h4, forcing Vidit to give up his queen. In this position, the situation is quite a bit more tame. Neither side is experiencing problems with king safety. And perhaps the shoe will be on the other foot if Vidit is the one who takes on g3. He will get the same privileges of eventually putting a knight on g4. But he has to time it right, because if he takes on g3 in this position, that's usually not very advised. You're usually advised to wait for white to castle kingside. If you don't, then white will recapture with the h-pawn, and the rook on h1 will essentially have developed itself without making a single move. Now, what are the standard ideas for both sides here? I think for black, you're trying to prepare e6, e5, and you want to make sure that you don't get too cramped. It's very clear that Vidit, with his move queen e7, he's coordinating his rooks. So he's taking care of the sort of standard opening things, but he's also preparing the move e5. Of course, that's not the only pawn break. And the more traditional pawn break is c7, c5, which potentially Vidit could even play in this position. Oftentimes, the way that this gets tactical is black plays c5, sacrificing the pawn on b7, and then starts chasing white's queen around the board, and things get totally chaotic. And this is a big moment. I think Vidit is clearly thinking about it. So he's asking himself, do I really need to play a move like rook b8? Now, there's nothing inherently wrong with a move like rook b8, but maybe it's too slow, and maybe it gives Grischuk that extra tempo he needs to ferry his king over to the king side and get it to safety. And if he gets his king to safety, then the effect that the move c5 has is greatly diminished. Opening the center is a lot more sexy if your opponent's king is still in the center. Let's see what happens. Rook a b8. He bites the bullet. And I think it's clear from the time he spent on this move that Vidit is not playing this move because he loves his position. He just believes that this pawn would be too much of a price to pay. So he plays rook b8, very patiently defending the pawn. The one benefit of this move, the one tactical benefit, is that potentially b7, b5 becomes a more serious idea. In fact, I think I was pointing out e5 and I was pointing out c5, but Vidit keeps shifting his intended pawn break further and further to the left. b5 is now a serious idea, which will chase the bishop away from c4. The reason behind this is once the rook gets to b8, you cannot take on b5. You'll pin your own minor piece and you'll lose your own minor piece. So for example, if white castles in this position, which I think is very likely, and Grischuk actually takes on d6, so he initiates the trade on his own. Black would have likely played b5 in this position, and bishop takes b5 loses very straightforwardly to the move a6. So as nicely placed as the queen is on b3, there are some drawbacks to that. And so Grischuk decides, let's change things up a little bit, and let's ask Black another question. Bishop takes d6. Now Vidit thinking once again, how does he recapture? How does he recapture? He takes with the queen. Now, taking with the pawn was very enticing because it would have made the structure very symmetrical, but white would have had some lingering and rather annoying pressure on the queen side. Okay, so now b5 is no longer a threat because white can recapture with the knight hitting black's queen. a6 by Vidit, clearly preparing it though. And if you gave black 2 more moves, he would play b5 and chase the bishop away, and then c5 and be completely fine. But look at Alexander Grischuk. He understands that Vidit's idea here is very one-dimensional. Black's play hinges entirely on his pawn play on the queen side, and white is setting himself up for that scenario. Now c5 is still possible. It doesn't lose, but with the white rook on d1, Vidit is not going to play this move with quite as much abandon. He's going to put some thought into it. So rook fd1 clearly preparing. Both sides clearly preparing for the center to open up. Kind of reminiscent of the last game, the Armageddon game, where you had this phase of the game where the players were maneuvering around and beating around the bush, and they were both preparing for what seemed like an imminent pawn push by white that would cause the center to open up. And this is a type of positional battle that can seem very boring, but in fact, there's a lot of nuance and a lot of subtlety that is required to play well in these types of situations, where you're essentially preparing your pieces for the position to open up, and the side that has prepared better ultimately takes the cake. h3 by Grischuk. He's preparing for the zombie apocalypse. First thing you need, a Luft square for your king. You need to tell that to add to Jesse Eisenberg's list from the movie. h3, very important. Also, you're discouraging black from ever playing the move bishop h5, which, by the way, is a rather nasty idea anytime you have this type of scenario. You do not want to allow bishop takes f3 if you're Grischuk. But bishop h5 can be nicely met either with bishop e2 or even with g4. And Vidit says, hey, I like that idea. That makes 2 of us. h6 is played. Ball back in Grischuk's court. How does white continue to improve his position? Bishop e2. I like this move. Now he's discouraging Vidit from playing b5. b5 no longer comes with a tempo, so white will have time to react to that move. Very, very positional. Of course, the main pawn break is c5. Vidit plays it anyway. Vidit says, you moved your bishop. I don't care. I want the space. He plays b5, and he doesn't necessarily have to follow it up with c5. But that is kind of the ideal arrangement because he's got some of these weak squares on the c file, what Grischuk wouldn't give to be able to play a move like knight a4. If white's knight lands on c5, if white's knight lands on c6, it's over, but you can't get there. Can't go through a4, can't go through e4, but Vidit has to keep a very vigilant eye on the c file, at least until the moment that he plays c5. So how can this game continue? What is Grischuk going to do? I think he might play a move like a3 here. Now, he could also engage Vidit on the queen side and play a4. Then things get a little bit more tactical. I could see Vidit playing c5 pretty imminently, and then the game will likely fizzle out. We might get a bunch of trades down the d file. That's one scenario. Another scenario is Vidit is afraid to play c5 because he doesn't want to give white's rooks a justification for their existence. And so we get kind of another maneuvering phase. He goes c6, and maybe Grischuk drops his knight to a2. He's actually found a way for his knight to circumnavigate the globe and evade all of the obstacles and get to b4. If the white knight gets to b4, it's one spot away from c6. It's a skip, a hop, and a jump away from paradise. Instead, he puts his queen on a2, setting up the very serious positional threat of b4 and basically telling Vidit, you've got one more chance, boy, to play the move c5. If Vidit doesn't play c5 here, Grischuk will play b4, and then you're never going to be able to play it. I think for better or for worse, Vidit has to play c5. And I think that he survives the impending opening of the center because the black queen is now a lot safer. It will no longer be targeted by the white rooks quite as straightforwardly. We have a trade on c5, and I think scenario 1 is the most likely. We might get a trade on the d file. Grischuk has been pressing for an advantage this entire game, but that's not necessarily a permanent state of affairs. The white queen is out of the game. White needs to be a little bit careful here to make sure that black's activity on the queen side doesn't get out of control, and Grischuk does just that. Re-establishes order by slamming the knight down on e5. Proverbially, of course, this is an online game, and challenging the bishop on g6. Now, knight takes g6, of course, not something that Vidit can allow, as he slides his bishop back to h7. The downside of this move is that this takes away the escape square for black's king, but the prospect of a back rank combination here is extremely slim. That is not the priority right now. The priority right now for black is to make sure that all of your pieces are stable, and Grischuk can try to keep this initiative going with b4. In fact, I'm expecting either b4 or a move like bishop f3. Just because black has pushed the pawn up to c5 doesn't mean the c6 square isn't still a weakness. It absolutely is. And it is the square that white's knight is ultimately targeting. Grischuk likes these cagey positional moves. He likes to keep the pressure up, and he plays b4. He plays the most straightforward move. He attacks the knight on c5. Probably the knight has to jump to e4. But Vidit is definitely the one who has to be a little bit more careful here. A lot of threats hanging in the air. If the knights get traded, then you have to start paying very serious attention to back rank combinations. You have to make sure that you have a set of eyes on the back rank. Got to sweep the perimeter. Knight c to e4, knight c to d7. Maybe also possible, just getting this knight off your back. And knight c to d7, is that too good to be true? Can you just get this knight off of e5? Because what's causing black's position to be uncomfortable? Well, it's two things. The first is the fact that he's kind of cramped. And the second is the fact that he doesn't have this escape square for his king. If he can get rid of this knight on e5, he gets rid of essentially the main source of danger. Let's see. Vidit taking his time. Both players now under 5 minutes, but this is not the kind of position that I would be too worried about having like a minute to handle. You know, it's simple enough. One way or the other, we're going to get a bunch of trades in the next few moves. And Vidit realizes that, so he's taking as long as it takes to figure out where to put his knight. He does go for knight e4. Okay. Now, if Grischuk wants to draw, if he wants to bail out, he can take on e4, he can take on d8, but he's keeping the tension. He's sliding his queen to b2. And it's not so easy for Vidit to solve all of his problems here. Now, there's one more thing that black has to be very careful about. Let's say all of the pieces disappear except the bishops. Even a same-colored bishop endgame is not necessarily a dead draw. If you look at these pawns on a6 and b5, in a distant future, and maybe not so distant future, white's bishop could land on b7. And that's basically game over immediately. So this pawn on a6 is one that Vidit has to keep an eye on. The symmetrical idea doesn't exist because with same-colored bishops, black's bishop cannot attack white's pawns. They're on dark squares. That's the problem with some of these positions that look totally lifeless. You start trading pieces and you suddenly realize you're saddled with a weakness that you can't defend. So Grischuk definitely in the driver's seat. No question about it. He's not willing to sign the peace accords until Vidit has demonstrated a little bit more defensive prowess. How do you recapture? All three recaptures are on the table, including king h2. Just kidding. Knight takes d1 looks pretty attractive here. Kind of pulling out the chair from under black's knight. Not only removing the off-ramp for the knight, but also opening up the c-file and a potential infiltration to c6. So this may look like the least attractive way to recapture. Grischuk does play the sort of automatic move, but he definitely invested some thought into knight takes d1. I was pretty partial to it. Now rook to d8 keeps the trades up. Vidit could also play rook to c8. Both sides under 4 minutes, and he does play rook c8. He says, you got the d file? Well, I got the c file. And who's to say that file is worse? Now Grischuk's knight on c3 is attacked. And very important, the queen on b6 is sort of the unsung hero of Vidit's defensive effort here because it guards the d8 square, which means all back rank combinations for the moment off the table. It's also virtually unattackable. That queen on b6 is shielded by its right-hand man, the pawn on b5. It's the Podrick, the pawn on b5. 2, it's Brienne, the queen on b6. Looks like Vidit has everything in order here. He's also 40 seconds up on the clock. And we have a stark difference in the time management here. Vidit has been consistently up on the clock throughout this match, but Alexander Grischuk is the one guy who can have 3 seconds after 5 moves, and you're completely confident in his ability to handle the complications. Queen b8 now is possible. Queen to d6. This knight on e5. It's been a problem for a long time. What you don't want to do if you're Vidit, you don't want to trade twice on c3. Because that is the path to hell. It gives white the c-file, and that is exactly how you end up losing your queenside pawns. So there's been a lot of tension in a game that has appeared to be very symmetrical. It looks like they're heading for a draw, but that's not necessarily the case. And Grischuk has managed to keep up the pressure all throughout the middle game. He's done an amazing job of keeping Vidit on his toes. And eventually, Vidit might crack. He goes rook d8, and he keeps the rooks on the board. Now, funnily enough, they've switched roles. White controls the c-file, and black controls the d-file. Kind of an interesting change of affairs here. Bishop takes e4. Vidit recaptures correctly, guarding the c6 square. And now he's once again reopened an escape ramp for the black king. But Grischuk reinforces his control over the c-file. Queen to c3. Finally, the queen emerges from its hiding place on b2. And you can kind of start sensing that Grischuk is orienting his play around these 2 weak pawns. He wants to go queen c7. He wants to swap queens and start attacking the a6 pawn. Vidit is in a little bit of trouble here. And the further down the clocks dwindle, the harder it becomes to keep coming up with accurate defensive moves. How does Vidit keep Grischuk's activity in check? Now, knight d5, I think, is not literally in check. You certainly don't want to go rook d1 here. Knight d5 is tempting, hitting the queen, stopping queen c7. But some doors close, other doors open. Knight d5 allows queen c6. And that's an even faster avenue to attacking the a6 pawn. 2 minutes on the clock for the Indian Grandmaster, who doesn't even want to be here. He was expecting to win that first match. Then he was better in the Armageddon. He loses that. Now he's suddenly worse in the first of a best of 2. Now his back is against the wall. Grischuk could actually go knight c6 here, and that's a really nasty move, and he plays it. Alexander Grischuk showing why he's been at the world elite level for 20 years now. That doesn't happen by accident. If you take that knight, that's the worst kind of material imbalance you could possibly have here. Couldn't go rook c8 because of the knight fork on e7, very important. Notice how many tactical details hide behind the scenes of excellent positional play. Now, the knight can park itself on a5, awaiting further instructions. You could also play on the king side here, and he plays knight a5. Queen c7, once again, a serious positional threat. I think Vidit's in big trouble here. The eval bar doesn't reflect that. It's showing a very modest edge for white. But if you compare this position to the position 10 moves ago and you realize that he's under 2 minutes, Vidit is one mistake away from having a technically losing position. But knight f6, good move. The black knight says, I will not go down without a fight, preparing to move into d5 whenever necessary. And now a big moment for Grischuk. He can play queen c7. He can force the queens off the board, but I'm not totally convinced that that's the best version of the endgame to go into, because Vidit would trade and Vidit would put a knight on d5. And the problem is that white's knight on a5 looks really pretty, but it's not actually doing anything. And that becomes problematic if you have an endgame where you need every one of white's pieces to basically be a good team member and attack the pawn on a6. And so Grischuk chases the bishop away instead. Vidit will not move the bishop automatically. He'll think about knight d5 and he will reject it. Knight d5 walks right into queen c5. The worst kind of queen trade. Vidit's got to bite the bullet. He's got to keep the bishop on this diagonal. Very important. If the bishop moves back and stays on the b1h7 diagonal, queen c6 becomes a very serious possibility. Not immediately. 2 roads stare at him in the face. Will he take the one less traveled by? We'll see. Well, he's got to travel down one of them. Vidit's indecisive. He's down to a minute. The pressure keeps escalating and escalating. And it almost seems like nothing has happened, and yet you can just sense that the pressure has reached a zenith. Grischuk, queen c5, maybe rushed that slightly. He could have played king f2 and made sure that he's got a pair of eyes on the e3 pawn. Vidit says, no thanks. Thanks, but no thanks. No queen trade for you. Vidit will keep the queens on the board at all costs. This is very likely to get into a time scramble. Grischuk still with that nice little time cushion. He's down to 1:20. Vidit's under a minute. Rook to d1. The queen keeps getting chased around. Queen to b8. The knight could rejoin the game by jumping into c6 with tempo. But the queen has a square waiting for it on g3. I bet that wasn't on your bingo chart. The black queen landing on g3. Not only are the queens still on the board, but black's queen is now driving the hunt for counterplay. Grischuk can try to smoke it out of g3. He should smoke it out of g3, and he does. Queen to e5, another queen trade on the table. Unthinkable for Vidit. He trades. That is a really dangerous move. That is a potentially very unwise move. He could have kept the queens on the board with queen h4. He had a way out. But now he's down to 30 seconds, facing the threat of rook d6. Forget the bishop on g6. Grischuk's not going to take that. His knight on e5 is worth its weight in gold. Protect the pawn on e3. He can go king f2. He shouldn't go e4. He does go e4, but he gives Vidit a free tempo, knight c3. Maybe this will give Vidit the chance that he needs to wiggle out of the situation. Rook to d2. But look at this bishop on g6. It's totally imprisoned. It can't rejoin the game. It can't add a defender to the a6 pawn. I still think the black's position is critical here. 20 seconds for Vidit. If he manages to hold this position, then he is the ultimate hero. He did hold a losing position in the first game, but the circumstances were totally different. It was Grischuk who was down to a couple seconds. Now Grischuk has all the confidence behind him. 2 seconds for Vidit. He doesn't see a move. Tries to get active with his rook. Obviously, the game far from over. There's a lot of tactics hiding in the air. King f2 would be a blunder. It would walk into bishop takes e4. Or maybe a semi-blunder. Wouldn't be disastrous, but not a transformation that Grischuk wants to allow. He's down to 40 seconds. Can't fall asleep. He moves his bishop back. Knight b1 would be an attempt by Vidit to complicate the game. And that is what he's relying on. I think no, knight b1. He's not in time. He's not in time. Rook takes a6. Defends the pawn on a3. I missed that too at first. Vidit goes after the pawn on a3, but he's collapsing. He's falling apart on all seams. He loses both of his pawns. And this is the nightmare scenario that I pointed out 25 moves ago. And Grischuk's not done there. He's going after more material. Rook to c6 ends the game immediately. It's over. b5. Vidit tries to keep the rooks on the board. His only hope is that Grischuk blunders this pawn. As long as Grischuk can keep this pawn protected, I would simply take the bishop here and win another one of black's pawns on the king side. And he goes rook d6, keeping the knight restricted, but rook to b2 maybe. No, but the problem is black doesn't have any purchase. Black doesn't have a single source of counterplay here. White has no weaknesses. Get back there, young man, says the g pawn. Not yet. Is it going to say that? g4, it is. G stands for Grischuk. It also stands for g pawn. It also stands for get back to g6. 7 seconds for Grischuk. Now he's in familiar territory. Rook to d3. Clinical Russian school of chess. Converted. He blundered his knight, or has he? He did blunder his knight. He did blunder his knight. Knight d3, knight c5. But he's still winning. I think Grischuk's still winning. This is unreal. He is still winning because the bishop is so bad that he can use the combined forces of his king, his pawn, and his bishop to eventually get rid of black's knight. He definitely blundered that, but he's still winning. But the path is a little bit more narrow now. Bishop to b5 was the winning move. Now it's a game again. f5, trying to trade the bishops. Oh my gosh. Takes, king e5. Now white's king is trying to get into c7. That is the goal. But look at Vidit. He's opening up his bishop h5, and it's a draw. No way. Actually, Grischuk could lose this. If Grischuk... Oh my god. FG? No, but FG was wrong. Vidit should have pushed his pawn. Oh my gosh, Vidit should not have traded on g4. Now he's going to lose both of his minor pieces. And Grischuk holds on to win. Oh my gosh, Vidit was one move away. He could have played h4. And that was it. That was game drawn. I have to show this. Vidit was literally one move away from an absolutely unthinkable comeback. He simply forgot that the knight was going to get trapped at the end of the line. Let me show you what just happened there at the end, because I know people are confused. What on earth did we just see? Now, it all started when Grischuk simply hung his knight. Maybe he thought that the pawn promoted, but I think he forgot e5 was protected. Vidit gets his knight around. It's still winning for white, but the path has become more narrow. Vidit finds all of the moves other than h4, and that's it. Actually, he's playing for a win here, believe it or not. I think he would have won this game because black promotes first, white promotes second, and black can simply restore the material equality with queen takes f3. And if anybody's playing for the win, it's black because white's king is less safe. Instead, he plays hg, white responds with fg, and Vidit realizes that his intended move, bishop e4, doesn't actually help because white plays king c7. And the problem is that it's not enough to get rid of the b pawn. You actually also have to keep your pieces alive. And to the great bad luck of Vidit, white's g-pawn is on the right square at the right time, at the right place. It can be easily protected by the bishop, and black runs out of ideas. What a heartbreaker. Vidit has not moved from his chair. This is a very bitter pill to swallow. Alexander Grischuk, what a win. It was a brilliant positional game worthy of Capablanca up until the very last second when he played knight e5. He hung his knight, but the position was so winning that he still managed to survive and thrive. Vidit was oh so close. He loses again, and now it is Vidit. The shoe is officially on the other foot. It is Vidit in a must-win situation in the second game. The consolation for him, he's got the white pieces. And honestly, in our Division 2 and Division 3 matches today, the white pieces have meant something. You know, we're used to it not mattering in rapid play who has white, who has black. The shorter the time control, the less it matters which color you have. But in this particular match, Grischuk has been able to put on the heat with his London system, an opening that I think Vidit will be very busy reviewing after today's match. But Vidit has managed to do the same thing when he's had white. He's played that Catalan. He played e4 against Grischuk in their other game. So both sides have managed to exert pressure on the other with the white pieces. But now Vidit has no choice. He needs to get off on the right track. He needs to put that game behind him. And if he wins this game, he forces another Armageddon that will finally decide the winner of the CrunchLabs Masters second division. What a performance by Grischuk, the indefatigable Alexander Grischuk. At 40 years old, he's played every day. He defeated Hikaru Nakamura yesterday in pretty stunning fashion. Now he's won on demand the first match. He's forced the reset. He's won the first game of the reset, and now he is millimeters away from just potentially one game away, oh so close, to another incredible CCT comeback. We've seen so many of them now. We've seen MVL do this to Magnus. We've seen Alireza do this to Magnus, but that was the top division. Can Grischuk do the unthinkable in the second division? Okay, well, Alexander Grischuk taking a little break here. He's earned it. Vidit has not moved this entire time. He's just mulling over what just happened. It would have been a lot less painful, paradoxically, if you would have gotten crushed. That's a bad feeling. It's a crappy feeling, but it's a far crappier feeling when you were getting crushed, you got your chance, you exploited it, and you were just one move away from potential glory. He would have drawn the game. The momentum would have been entirely on his side. Now it's the other way around. Okay, about to get started here as Alexander Grischuk assumes his seat. Now, these two players have faced off quite a few times. They've actually never played a rapid game, to my knowledge, but they have played a lot of rapid and blitz. They played in the Berlin World Rapid Championship in 2015 for the first time, which was a 26-move win by Vidit with the black pieces. He needs to take some inspiration from his self 10 years ago, and he does with 1c4. So Vidit changing tune completely, avoiding opening theory, and going for a kind of queenside fianchetto English setup. So a clear indication that Vidit is not interested in a theoretical duel. He's not interested in a mainline Catalan. He is interested in just taking Grischuk out of his comfort zone and getting a playable position in the middle game. A double fianchetto. as he plays g3 and fianchettos his other bishop. Now, obviously, we're still in theoretical territory. It's not like he played 1a4 or 1h4. This is still a very well-known position. In fact, I would say that this type of opening was very popular in the 60s and 70s. Tigran Petrosian was a champion of these types of systems with white. And of course, the big question here, does white want to play d4? And I think he does. And will we get kind of a pawn cube in the center? Grischuk can play d5, and white can respond with d4. And just like we've had at several points in this match, we can have a hanging pawn structure for either side, actually. So if white plays d4 in this position, then both sides have the possibility, have the authority to essentially establish a hanging pawn structure for the other side. Black can play d takes c4 and c takes d4, or white can do the same thing with c takes d5 and d takes c5. And that's why these pawn structures are so complicated. It's because there are so many choices for both sides. You can take either of the pawns, you can take just one of the pawns, you can take both of them, and you can do it at various points. So Vidit is asking himself right now, do I want to go into this? Do I want to play d4? Or does he want to discharge the tension right away with c takes d5? Now, in a must-win situation, I would never play cd. I think that would be a terrible move, because if we could pull up an analysis board, c takes d5 here would allow black to take with a knight. And not only would the d3 square then be a serious weakness, but black's next move would be bishop f6. And this is the thing you want to avoid, just a bunch of piece trades in the center, and a lifeless position where you really can't create a situation where your opponent feels uncomfortable. Instead, Vidit plays knight c3, inviting Grischuk into playing d4, but Grischuk's not going to do that. He's going to manage his risk here with knight c6. He trades on c4. And I actually think that we are not going to get the move d4 by Vidit here. d4 would be a serious positional mistake, because it would leave the c4 pawn caught with its pants down, and the knight from c6 can jump to a5. The bishop could slide to a6, and before you know it, the c4 pawn could be under serious fire. So Hikaru Nakamura has had this type of pawn structure with the white pieces. He likes to put the pawn on d3, and for very good reason. So white's plan here is likely to play d3, maybe solidify that whole construction with rook a d1, and eventually white's going to take his attention to the king side. You're likely going to see this knight moving away from f3, maybe knight to h4, and white's going to start expanding on the king side with f4, maybe even g4, g5. This is the sort of textbook plan, because that bishop on b2 is like, well, what about me? I want to join the party too. I want to do something. And in order for the bishop to get involved, eventually you need to kick this knight away from f6. So let's see how this unfolds. I'm jumping the gun here. Grischuk starts out with queen c7. Making space for the rook to come to d8. Obviously, he's not worried about a move like knight b5. Vidit might play it, but it's not a serious grab at the initiative, and I don't think Vidit should get distracted with one-move threats. He probably is going to go d3 here. Okay, knight e1. There we go. Moving the knight out of the way and clearly preparing the move f4. I'll bet a silver dollar we're going to see that move at some point in the next few moves. Now, what are black's ideas here? Well, black has a couple of options. Black can meet fire with fire. Black can start his own set of aggressive actions on the queen side with b5. Even if that comes at the cost of a pawn, you could play this Benko style and try to open up the queen side, especially because f4 is not without its drawbacks. Obviously, white is slightly weakening the king, and Grischuk, knight to a7. What a cold-blooded response. He's doing two things at once. He's trying to get the bishops off the board, simplify the position, and he's clearly trying to prepare b5. And the big question asked in so many openings and so many positions, whose attack is stronger? And yes, both sides have an attack. White has a clear pawn storm on the king side. Black has an equivalent pawn storm on the queen side. Unfortunately, white's king is nowhere near that side of the board. But if white's attack fails, you are going to be staring down the barrel of a very, very nasty situation on the other side. Just ask any King's Indian player. Now, how could this go wrong for black? And why am I concerned about Grischuk here? Well, I'm concerned because once the move g5 is made, so let's say that Grischuk takes on g2. Let's pull up an analysis board here real quick. I think Grischuk is going to spend some time evaluating the move b5, and he's very likely to play it. White's going to take back with the queen, and he just did. And if black dilly-dallies and procrastinates, White's attack becomes devastating in the span of 2 moves. Like the moment f5 is played or g5 is played, White starts pushing these pawns down the board. The knight has to go back to e8, and you can just see visually how bad this becomes with f6 now in the cards. Grischuk has no time to waste, and therefore he wastes no time. Literally and figuratively, g5 knight e8 is on the board, and this is also the reason why he is not initiating the trade of bishops. He doesn't want to help White's queen get to an even better spot on g2, where it would be x-raying the unprotected rook on a8 and setting up ideas of knight f6 check, which, by the way, is still a very serious tactical possibility, a timely sacrifice on f6. The white queen can come up to h5. The knight from e1, like zombies rising out of their graves. Kind of reminds me of the video for Michael Jackson's Thriller. Slow, gradual, but when there's a whole army of them and they're all out, it's pretty scary. Look at White's pieces. They looked passive. They look disjointed, but this knight from e1 can jump to d3. It can move up to e5. Vidit starts to smell blood here. He can also play h4 and sort of keep the status quo alive. I don't understand how Grischuk is going to continue. How is he going to generate counterplay? How is he going to complicate the game? Drastic measures are required for black here. He might play f5. He might start just exchanging as many pieces as he can get his hands on. Now Vidit taking his time, understanding that he needs to be perfect here. He has to win this game. It's the second game of the Grand Finals reset. He's lost the first match. He's lost the first game of the reset. If he wins, we go to an Armageddon that decides it all. This is the Division 2 Finals. Division 1 Finals coming your way tomorrow, 11 a.m. New York time. And it'll feature a wild Alireza Firouzja against MVL. It'll be a French on French matchup. Unmissable entertainment coming your way tomorrow. But right now, all eyes on these two worthy competitors in the second division. Still thinking, is Vidit still processing what is the best way of getting this attack started? He's done the easy part. He's gotten his pieces into position. And knight to d3, fantastic move. So far demonstrating some serious poise. Now, obviously, technically, this is a pawn sacrifice. Grischuk can take on c4, but this merely helps the knight get to where it wants to go anyway. Knight to e5 will follow. Maybe Grischuk wants to take on c4 so that he can get this knight on a7 back into the game via b5. One of the problems for black here is that suddenly his pieces are sort of clustered together, sitting idly by, as the king has to bear the brunt of this impending assault. Just look at the harmony among White's pieces. Both bishops fianchettoed, one responsible for defense, one responsible for being the linchpin of White's attack. Black can't move. You would love to play the move knight d6 here, but that walks headfirst into the avalanche, into the onslaught. It encourages knight f6 check. And that's one of the main problems. This knight is just sort of stuck there on e8. And total discord, cacophony among black's ranks here. Can Grischuk find some source of activity here? What is the lesser evil? That's the question he's asking himself. Maybe f5. Maybe you just get desperate. Maybe you go postal with a move like f5. But that causes more problems than it solves. So if we pull up an analysis board, what happens after f5? Well, Vidit's going to take on Passant because it's forced. And although you do get your knight out of e8, you actually create another serious weakness on e6. And at the end of the line, Vidit actually can still take on g2 with a queen. Rook takes e3. Nope. Knight takes e6. Survey says, fork on black's queen and the pawn on g7. Not a coincidence that Vidit's pieces all seem to be in the right place at the right time. That's just what happens. And his plan has worked to perfection. Grischuk doesn't see a move. He's just sitting there asking himself, I have no idea what to do. Okay, that's not literally what he's telling himself. That's a translation of what he's telling himself in a heavily redacted version. Let's put it that way. Knight to d6. So this is what he settled on. He took the pawn, accepted the gift, and now he's trying to get rid of some of Vidit's attacking force. Knight to d6 on the board. The game is far from over. Vidit has some calculating to do because knight f6 check is already on the table. This is a very serious candidate move. It has to be considered. Can you sacrifice the knight on f6 to open up black's king? Well, that's for Vidit to answer, not me. Now, one of the ideas behind this move, and I'm just going to show it really quickly, is after g takes f6, you actually don't have to take. And one of the main ideas for white involves this very sneaky move, knight g4, trying to force this pawn off of f6 so that you could deliver mate on h6. But Vidit has no reason to burn his bridges. He plays positionally, he takes d6. It's the boring solution, but it's also probably the correct solution. So he maintains, obviously, the attack, but he also maintains a positional advantage now on the other side of the board. Grischuk has these weak pawns. And the worst kind of attack to face is one where you're not even up material, because you don't have that light at the end of the tunnel. You can't tell yourself, okay, if I solve my problems now, I'll have something to be proud of later. I'll be up a pawn. No. Black is positionally and tactically worse. Is he losing? No. Grischuk just has to stay afloat. He has to get this knight into the game. And he's trying to do just that. Checking more items off his list, trying to get the queens off the board. Now, even an endgame looks terrible for black, but at least it looks a little more defensible than getting checkmated in the middle game. Is Vidit winning? No. It's about plus 1.5. He's much, much better, but definitely this is not a clear-cut win, and he's not even close to that yet. Now, 2 questions for Vidit. Does he trade queens? If so, how does he do it? Because he doesn't have to take on c6. He could play a move like rook b1, very much up his alley. He likes moves like this. Rook a c1 or rook fc1 even would be my prediction. If he wants to keep the queens on the board, he can play queen g4 or queen e2, but that would give Grischuk access to some nice squares along this diagonal. Yeah, the accuracy, pretty unreal for Vidit. He's played a perfect game thus far. It ain't over. He does go rook fc1. Exactly the way that he likes to play. He says, I'm welcoming a queen trade, but only on my terms. Grischuk now has to watch out. This bishop drops back, very alert. Now Vidit can keep the pressure up with a move like rook a to b1. Keep playing the game of chicken. And he does just that. Bishop b5, a move played in the same spirit. Now, obviously, he's trying to provoke Grischuk into playing f6, but I'm not so sure that this is a move you want to provoke your opponent into. If I'm Grischuk, f6 actually looks pretty appealing to me. G takes f6, then you trade on g2. And the more the position opens up, the less attention white is able to pay to the queen side. Instead, he goes queen d5, making space for his knight. That knight has been asleep. It slept through the apocalypse. Finally, it gets back on its feet. All 4 of them. The stallion moves up to c6, hitting the bishop on e5. That was a weird move by Vidit. It's complicated the process here. Maybe he can slide his rook up to b7. But suddenly this bishop on e5 is neither here nor there. It's like a middle schooler at a dance. It's got to move back to a1 if it wants to move. It can't go back to c3. Can't really go back to b2 either. That rook on b1 is going to start to complain. What do you do? Vidit down on time. So impressive the way Grischuk has actually kept playing relatively fast, even in this extremely difficult situation. Again, this is must-win for Grischuk. For Vidit, it's a best of 2. It's not a best of 4 like their first match was. It's a best of 2. No more chances for Vidit. What do you do? The clock is ticking down to 3 minutes. His pieces look perfectly positioned, but good pieces do not win games, as Tara said. Good moves do. Now, Vidit also doesn't even have the option of trading queens anymore. He can't take on d5 because black will take back with a pawn. Bishop c7, maybe. He goes back to a1. I like this move. He bites the bullet. He admits his mistake, but a costly mistake it was. Now Grischuk could get his knight into b4 and then potentially to d3, and I'm no longer convinced that white's advantage is all that extensive. I still think that Vidit has great winning chances. He's still better, no question about it. But Grischuk must be thrilled to have what he's got here. The tempting move here is knight to b4, but it's not a fact that when the knight lands on d3, it's going to be so great. Because from d3, it actually has no way out, assuming white plays a3. So Grischuk trying, I think, to make sure that his knight isn't going to get trapped on that square. Knight to b4. That's the critical move. Maybe Grischuk is thinking, should I trade queens maybe first to clarify the situation? He's got other moves as well, like rook to b8. Sort of keeping up the status quo. I like rook b8. It's a pretty practical move. Grischuk thinking. Thinking and thinking. He's now down on time. Maybe I praised him too early, but the clock is really not a factor in this game until one side gets below a minute. This is a position that's simple enough for both sides to handle, but a big decision here to be made for Grischuk. I can guarantee you the wheels are turning in his brain, trying to get a handle on this move knight b4. Still no move by Sasha. And he's done it. He's taken the plunge. The knight onto d3 it goes, surrounded by enemy forces. How is he going to keep that knight protected? And right now, the security detail for the knight is the queen and the rook. But the queen's not going to be there forever. Vidit is already threatening to play queen takes d5. Grischuk moves the queen away. His priority is to keep the knight on d3 safe. Vidit has to combine pressure on the knight with pressure on the king side. Also, there's a threat. Queen f5, such a sneaky move, attacking the rook on b1. That rook on b1 is unprotected, and it is in the crosshairs of the queen. Vidit is very alert. He moves it to f1. Why is he moving it to f1? Because I think he's worried about the prospect of Grischuk going e5 and breaking up this pawn chain. He's trying to discourage it. But often when you just discourage something, you actually end up doing the opposite. e5 is absolutely on the table, nevertheless, for Grischuk, whose goal here is to complicate the game as much as possible. He's down to 90 seconds. Vidit's also potentially threatening the move e4, separating the queen and the knight. Suddenly, once the prospect of the queen trade was taken off the negotiating table, I've started to become very pessimistic about Black's position once again. And he's down to a minute. And again, he's in this WTF do I do kind of mode. The second wave of the attack is going to be a lot scarier than the first, because the knight on d3 is on the chopping block. 50 seconds for Grischuk. He's calculating e5. He's calculating other pawn breaks. He plays f6, but he's walked into e4. And will he lose this knight on d3? This is what he was looking at. e4, queen g6 gets very complicated, and it's not a given that Vidit finds all the best moves here. White's king is also very weak. So this game can turn around at the drop of a hat if Vidit is not perfect here. He's down to 2 minutes. He's played e4. Queen back to g6, only move. Now the knight on d3, it's going to be attacked. Queen to e2. The computer shows that that is the only correct move. There is no other way to maintain an advantage, because rook f3 walks into knight e1 with a fork. Other queen moves give up the e4 pawn. And the move queen f3, well, that walks into the x-ray. That just looks really awkward. I think he's going to do it. Queen e2, just by process of elimination. There aren't that many other moves. Maybe h4, but you don't want to let Black open up the f-file. Then the game becomes super chaotic. Vidit down to 90 seconds. Both sides are willingly entering this time scramble, because where would we be without every game in the CCT that matters ending up in a time scramble? Vidit is thinking. Grischuk frantically trying to look for a resource against queen e2. Maybe queen e2 can be met with rook to d4. White's knight on c4 is also not safe. Maybe this is what's giving Vidit pause, but he's down to a minute. I would take that eval bar and throw it in the trash can. It's showing +2 after queen e2, but how on earth do you figure out anything with 50 seconds on your clock? I can't see a response after queen e2, rook d4. Neither can Vidit. He's down on time. He's down to 45 seconds. Not liking what he's seeing. He's paralyzed. He goes h4, so he does keep the status quo, but this gives Grischuk a tempo, and rook d4. Rook d4 is nasty. And will we get a dose of nasty from Grischuk? He blunders. Rook takes d3. This was Vidit's idea. What a devilish move he just played. He lured Grischuk into taking on g5. Is he going to recapture? No. He takes on d3, and Grischuk cleanly loses a piece. Rook takes d3, knight to e5. I didn't see that at all, and neither did Grischuk. And after knight e5, black is unable to connect the queen and the rook, so he's going to lose a clean piece here. Grischuk has to try to find counterplay on the king side. He will have 2 pawns for the piece, to be fair. But he's got to move. 15 seconds. Got to accept the reality. Goes rook takes d2, trying to get as many pawns as possible. But it's not enough. H takes g5. Vidit is up a piece. Vidit's up a piece. Everything is stable. Everything is stable. Black's bishop is out of the game. I think Grischuk has to try c4. It's not over yet, but he's down to 5 seconds. What a turn this game just took. Just when it seemed like Grischuk was out of the woods, Vidit had come through with another crazy trap. But he's got to convert this. He's got an extra piece for 2 pawns, but he's got a weak king. And Grischuk is just going to keep his queen as active as possible. Can he take another pawn here? He can, and he does. Now he's got 3 pawns for the piece. But his own king is in a lot of danger. Let's not forget this bishop on a1. It might still have its moment in the sun. At the right moment, queen b2 could be nasty, but not right now. Where's the win? Grischuk. Grischuk staying alive. Rook to d1 by Vidit, activating his rook. There's a fork on g4 that's being threatened. An excellent defensive move by Grischuk. The queen trampolining like a lady on a mission. Queen to g4 is threatened. 15 seconds by Vidit. Can he keep his composure? Can he convert like Grischuk did in the previous game? His king is wide open. Queen e3 check. Now f4 is hanging. He's got to keep everything under control. Queen back to f2 is the only move here. But he might just end up giving up that pawn. Back to h3 goes black's queen. It's an all-out time scramble. Vidit has to win this game. He cannot repeat. Rook to d7. Here comes black's rook. I think Grischuk's saving this one. Vidit doesn't know what to do. He goes queen g2, back to e3. Rook to d2. Rook to d2 has to be calculated. Now Vidit's turn to go after black's king. Can black's king escape the web of checks here? Does white have anything more than a perpetual? He does not. As long as Grischuk keeps his king on f7 and e8, it's a draw. Just take with a pawn. Vidit doesn't have anything here. He has to repeat. Otherwise, he gets mated or he loses his bishop on a1. Grischuk's going to take this match. There's no move. Queen f3. Black simply takes and goes rook d1 and picks up white's bishop. Vidit doesn't see it. And he is going to acquiesce here to the draw. There are simply no other ways to avoid getting checkmated. And he'll let his clock run out. Alexander Grischuk. He does it. And now a full-on celebration. Well, that also involved just a fist bump. Wow, wow, wow. How does this seem to happen in every CCT event that I commentate? First, it was Firouzja doing it to Magnus, and now Alexander Grischuk. He defeats Hikaru yesterday. He has a nearly insurmountable task. He has to defeat Vidit twice because he's coming from the loser's bracket. He does it the first time after starting off with a loss. He forces an Armageddon and then wins it, and now he wins 2-0 in the grand final reset. And how did he do it? Incredible conversion in the first game. He blundered a knight. It didn't matter. And in the second game, some unbelievable resilience. Some incredible wizardry by Vidit. You have to take off your hat. It wasn't like Vidit played badly. Vidit played incredibly well, but it just wasn't enough gas left in the tank after that initial loss. Vidit was unable to fully compose himself. He had a chance in that first game to pull off an incredible comeback draw, but wasn't able to pull it off completely. Let's take a look at that second game, because textbook effort by Vidit, and then suddenly Grischuk was able to create chances and keep those chances alive until the very end. It was a great opening choice by Vidit, who's in a must-win situation, the double fianchetto English, which quickly becomes very tactical. Rather than getting the sort of hanging pawn structure, Vidit gets this pawn structure, which has been championed by Hikaru, and I've seen some Kramnik games, and he gets the attack going real quick. The bonfire starts on the king side. Grischuk tries to counter with some rapid counterplay on the queen side, but it's not enough. It's not significant enough. It's like pinching a dinosaur. You don't care about the c4 pawn. Vidit gets his pieces into the action, gets ready for the final breakthrough, and suddenly things get complicated again. Some minor mistakes and inaccuracies by Vidit allows Grischuk to get his pieces back into the game. The knight jumps into b4. Things get wild and tactical, and both sides now low on time. Vidit finds what seems to be the decisive idea. He goes h4, and just when it looks like he's lost control, he has a trick up his sleeve. Rook takes d3, an incredible idea. But Sasha Grischuk composes himself, finds a way to give up the rook for the maximum amount of material. And then it was pandemonium, and it was incredible defense. Takes another pawn, activates his queen, activates his rook a little bit later, and Vidit, he exhausted every opportunity, but ultimately, Alexander Grischuk, he is the man of the hour. He's the man of the last 3 hours. He is the winner of Division 2 on the strength of 2 consecutive match victories over Vidit. He had saves, he had technical conversions, he had it all, and Alexander Grischuk is the winner of Division 2. Arjun, he won far less adventurously, much earlier in Division 3. Wow. We congratulate Alexander Grischuk, and we will have him in the studio for a short interview. But as we get him set up, and before we go on our final break, we wanted to remind you that this summer, you should kick your game up a notch with 50% off premium membership, including a 7-day free trial on Chess.com. That's unlimited game review, puzzles, lessons, and more, plus a breezy ad-free experience for your beachside chess games. No code needed. Anyone with a basic membership can claim this offer. As you sip your pina colada and you enjoy the waves crashing on the ocean, wherever you are, you're in the office, and you need a distraction, 7-day free trial, 50% off. Don't waste any time. Go to go.chess.com/summer_offer right now for 50% off premium membership. And we hope you're enjoying the summer. We hope you enjoyed that victory by Grischuk. Sasha Grischuk joins us in the studio to explain how he did it in just a couple of minutes.
Blunder, rookie 7!
He goes for mate. He doesn't even want the pawn. Oh my gosh.
Oh, and rook takes g3, blundered his queen. And Hikaru wins.
We gotta move. We moved that with 0.5 seconds.
Wesley held it, b5. There's a queen sack on g3 and f leads to mate. And he's
Oh my goodness, that is beautiful. Wow. Just wow.
Rook a2. He missed it. Oh my gosh, I'm on. Hikaru had forced to mate. And it's a draw by agreement.
These guys are just two titans, two champions going at one another.
Hundreds of thousands of kids have used the CrunchLabs Build Box to learn how to create and build stuff while having a ton of fun at the same time. But what about something for teenagers and adults, where they can learn all the tools and tricks I use to create the builds on my channel? Well, I'm happy to say, starting today, that exists now. And this is it. It's called HackPack, and it's basically a series of really fun programmable robots that get delivered right to your door, where we build it together and learn step by step the kinds of engineering skills that go into making the builds on my channel. And don't be intimidated, because all these use a programmable microcontroller as the brain. Because if you can put together a Lego set, you can put together this. And it will work right out of the box. No programming required, and it will still be really fun. Heck yeah.
There's a shortcut for sizing up any chess position.
Chess structures is how we understand chess quickly. And how can you evaluate a complicated position in a second or two?
And giving you the tools to come up with a winning plan.
What I see here is not a weak pawn on d4. One can feel tremendous energy from the white side. Well, we have rooks in open files. My knights have great squares where they can jump to. Even this one can maybe jump further. My bishop maybe on b3, maybe on d3. You will not see just 12 pawns on a chessboard. No, you will start to see that this is a landscape. And it's a landscape where you can sort of see the hills, or rather the flow of energy.
in any opening you play.
Welcome to the chapter about the isoland, Caro-Kann formation, the Slav formation, Carlsbad structure, Stonewall structure, King's Indian structure type 1, type 2, the hedgehog structure, the Moroccan structure.
And you can learn it all before your beard grows too long. Grandmaster Peter Heine-Nielsen presents Chess Structures, a Grandmaster Guide. Try it for free on Chessable at chessable.com/structures.
And we are back at the CrunchLabs Masters with Grandmaster Alexander Grischuk, who's pulled off the unimaginable, going from the loser's bracket to defeat Vidit twice in the grand finals and then the grand finals reset in an incredible fight that featured one topsy-turvy game after another. Sasha, you must be exhausted. We'll keep it brief. How do you feel about the matches today?
Yeah, I want to thank Vidit for those matches. I think it was really great matches, not just because I won. I think objectively, yeah, it was like, because he is like a rock. You know, it's very difficult to beat him. So you need to, keep, pouncing on him, to make small holes in the rock, and then maybe eventually it can collapse. But it takes a huge effort to beat him once, and I managed several times today.
How do you feel about the reset format? Do you like the fact that you come from the loser's bracket and you have another chance, or do you feel like it's overly exhausting to have to play two matches in one day like this?
I think it's great for Division 1 for sure. It's very fine for Division 2, but for Division 3 maybe it's a little bit too much. Because, Division 3 not that big of a prizes and so many players, so maybe it makes sense to switch in Division 3. But for first two divisions, it's more than fine.
Mm-hmm. How motivated are you to try to qualify to the finals at the end of the year, or are you treating every tournament like its own tournament? Are you keeping an eye on the overall standings?
Not really. Even if I would, what would it change? Yeah, it's not a Swiss tournament where you can, try to settle for +2 score or something. It's just match after match. There is no strategy except trying to win every match you play. So I don't pay attention.
We have one chat question from Vertical Simtot, who is wondering about your, obviously your famous ability to survive and thrive in crazy time scrambles. Can you tell us a little bit about the history of that? Is that always the way that you've played, being able to thrive in time pressure situations, or has your time management changed throughout your career?
I wouldn't call it during my career. I think it's changed before my career has started. I mean, of course, when I was like 8 years old, I didn't play that slow, but I think already in the year 2000, where I made it to semifinals in FIDE World Championship, I already was playing quite slow, and I was just, I had just turned 17. So unfortunately, I'm struggling for the whole career. Yeah.
Well, you've made definitely the most out of the struggles and the most out of your incredible matches today. Congratulations on winning Division 2. We look forward to seeing you in the next CCT event, and thanks for joining us for an interview.
Thank you.
Grandmaster Alexander Grischuk, the winner of Division 2. It was a fierce fight. There were some crazy back and forth moments, but ultimately experience prevailed as Grischuk defeats Vidit twice in the grand final in the Armageddon, and then defeats him 2-0 in the grand finals reset. You have to say Vidit played an incredible match. Both matches, really. Vidit avoided tilting. He didn't give away any games. He played his best, and ultimately every game was decided by fierce tactical battling, time scrambles, and Armageddons. It takes two authors to produce a masterpiece, and you got to congratulate Vidit as well. But Alexander Grischuk, the man of the hour, and Arjun, yeah, that was today. He defeats Yevgeny Alekseev. He doesn't even need 4 games. He does it in 3 games. And he doesn't need 2 matches. He does it in 1. He won both of his white games and easily held the black game, defeating Yevgeny Alekseev twice in a row, except the previous match was the winner's final. And the reason that Alekseev was in the loser's bracket, Erigaisi is the number 4 rated player in the world in classical chess. He's been on the up and up. He's had a back and forth CCT CrunchLabs event, but at the end of the day, class and his incredible tactical ability shined through as well. Erigaisi wins Division 3, Vidit wins Division 2. Let's take another look at our event standings, our overall standings and prize money distribution presented by Julius Baer. Here we see that Magnus and Alireza taking home 63K and 50K respectively. They're a country mile above the rest of the opposition. That includes Jan Nepomniachtchi, Vincent Keimer, Wesley So in 5th place. And obviously some of the American players, Hikaru and Fabi in particular, looking to raise their standings with a good performance in the next tournament. A lot of eyes also on Alexei Sarana and Vladimir Fedoseev, and a lot of other players like Denis Lazovic who've really made a career out of their incredible performances in these CCT events. So many stories have been written. Some chapters are closed, but other chapters remain to be written. And today was a very satisfying chapter as Alexander Grischuk goes from the loser's bracket and shows that, yes, it is possible. He wins Division 2. Erigaisi wins Division 3, but the best news is that Division 1 finals will be tomorrow. Firouzja takes on MVL. I'll be commentating that with David. GM Daniel Naroditsky here, commentating the Division 2 and Division 3 finals. We congratulate the winners, and we will see you tomorrow at 11 a.m. New York time for the Division 1 finals. Do not miss it. I hope you've enjoyed the show. Thank you, and goodbye.